The evening draped the neighborhood in a soft, deceptive calm, the kind that made you think nothing could go wrong until it did. The rhythmic hum of distant traffic blended with the faint chirping of crickets, a backdrop to the quiet shuffle of Amelia Jackson's uneven steps. She leaned heavily on her cane, its worn tip tapping against the cracked pavement as she guided her 6-year-old son, Ethan, homeward. His tiny hand nestled in hers, his grip tight with that unspoken trust only a child could offer. The dim streetlights cast long shadows behind them, flickering as they passed beneath each one, their silhouettes stretching and shrinking like uncertain ghosts. Amelia's dark skin glistened faintly with the sweat of exertion, her body aching from the constant effort it took to move with her disability. But her eye sharp, war-scanned the familiar streets of her home, alert to every sound, every shift in the air. Then came the boots, heavy, deliberate, thudding against the concrete like a drumbeat of impending trouble. "Ma'am, stop right there." A voice sliced through the stillness, cold and unyielding. Amelia's breath caught in her chest, her heart lurching as she halted mid-step. She turned slowly, her cane scraping the ground, and there he was, Officer Jake Peterson, his broad frame cutting an imposing figure against the twilight. His face was a mask of stone, his pale blue eyes raking over her with a scrutiny that felt like a physical weight. Middle-aged, with lines etched deep into his forehead from years of scowling, Jake carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't invite questions. His uniform was crisp, his badge glinting under the streetlight, but there was something in his posture, shoulders squared, chin tilted, that screamed he was looking for a fight. "ID, now," he barked, his voice sharp enough to make Ethan flinch. The boy's fingers tightened around Amelia's, his small body pressing closer to her side. She shifted her weight onto her stronger leg, the ache in her hip flaring as she tried to steady herself. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked, her tone measured but firm, a shield against the tremor she felt rising within her. She'd been here before too many times, stopped for no reason she could ever discern beyond the color of her skin and the ink etched into her arms. The tattoos, bold and intricate, curled across her forearms like a story she refused to let anyone erase. To her, they were art, a testament to survival. To him, they seemed to be a crime. "You're in an area where we've had reports of suspicious activity," Jake replied, his words clipped and devoid of warmth. His eyes lingered on her tattoos, narrowing as if they confirmed some silent accusation. "Show me your ID." Amelia's brow furrowed, a spark of indignation flaring in her chest. "I live here. This is my neighborhood. What's this about?" Her voice held steady, but inside, her pulse hammered, a frantic rhythm she couldn't quiet. Jake ignored her, his hand gesturing toward the worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "I'm going to need to search that," he said, his tone dropping lower, edged with a menace that made her stomach twist. Her jaw clenched, the muscles tightening until they ached. "That won't be necessary," she said, each word deliberate. "I haven't done anything wrong." Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his wide brown eyes darting between her and the towering officer. "Mommy, what's happening?" he whispered, his voice small and quivering. Amelia's heart cracked at the sound, but she forced a smile, bending slightly despite the pain it sent shooting through her leg. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, her gaze locked on Jake. "Everything's fine." Jake stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the space between them. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice a low growl. Hand over the bag. Amelia straightened as best she could, her spine stiffening with resolve. "No," she said firmly. "You don't have a reason to search my belongings." His face hardened, a flicker of something dark passing through his eyes. "Are you resisting, ma'am?" he asked, his tone dripping with threat. "Because I can make this official real quick." Before she could answer, his hand shot toward her bag, fingers brushing the strap with a roughness that made her recoil. She jerked it back, her voice rising despite herself. "Don't touch me, you're out of line." The sudden sharpness in her tone pierced the air, drawing the attention of a few stragglers nearby. A man walking his dog paused, his head tilting toward the scene. A woman pushing a stroller slowed, her phone slipping from her pocket as she angled it discreetly. The tension thickened, crackling like static before a storm. Jake squared his shoulders, oblivious or indifferent to the growing eyes on him. Listen, he hissed through clenched teeth. I don't care what you think you're entitled to. I'm asking you to comply. Amelia's chest heaved, her breath shallow as she fought to keep her composure. And I'm telling you I have nothing to hide, she fired back, her eyes blazing with a fire she could barely contain. But you have no right to treat me like this. Do your job the right way. Ethan whimpered, pressing his face into her hip. Mommy, I'm scared, he mumbled, his voice muffled against her jeans. She crouched slightly, her cane digging into the pavement for support, her free hand brushing his cheek. I know, baby, she whispered, her tone softening for him alone. It's going to be okay. But her hands trembled, betraying the calm she tried to project. She couldn't let the spiral knot with Ethan here, his small world teetering on the edge of fear, but she wouldn't let this man break her either. Jake's patience frayed visibly, his sneer twisting as he glanced at the onlookers. You think they're going to save you? He muttered, his voice low and mocking. Let's not make a scene for your kid's sake. Amelia's head snapped up, her voice steady despite the shaking in her limbs. You're the one creating the scene, she countered, her words a quiet blade. The crowd grew 5, then 10 people, murmurs rippling through them like a tide. Phones flashed, capturing the standoff in grainy, unforgiving light. Jake's hand brushed the radio on his shoulder, his fingers twitching. I'll call for backup if I need to, he warned, his eyes boring into hers. You really want this to go further? Amelia's heart thundered, a wild drumbeat against her ribs. But she held his gaze. Do what you have to do, she said, her voice unwavering. But I won't let you humiliate me in front of my son. His scowl deepened, and then, under his breath, came the words that lit a match in her soul. You people are all the same. The venom in his tone was unmistakable, a quiet hiss of contempt that made her blood boil. Excuse me, she demanded, her voice rising as the insult sank in. What did you just say? He didn't repeat it, but the sneer curling his lips said everything. This wasn't about law or order, it was personal, a power play rooted in something ugly and old. The crowd stirred, their discontent swelling. Leave her alone, a woman shouted, her voice sharp with outrage. She didn't do anything. Jake's hand hovered near his sidearm, his posture stiffening. Stay back, he barked, his authority fraying at the edges as more voices joined the chorus. Mommy, Ethan whispered again, his trembling fingers clutching her jeans. I'm here, Ethan, she said, forcing calm into her voice as she squeezed his hand. I won't let anything happen to you. Jake took another step, his eyes narrowing to slits. Last chance, he growled. Hand over the bag. Amelia didn't flinch. And I told you no, she said, her defiance a wall he couldn't breach. You're not laying a hand on me or my things. The standoff shattered in an instant. Jake's hand darted out, seizing her shoulder with a grip that dug into her flesh. He yanked at the bag, his strength overwhelming her fragile balance. Amelia cried out, stumbling as her cane clattered against the pavement. Stop it, she shouted, her voice breaking with a mix of terror and rage. You're hurting me. The crowd erupted, their anger spilling over like a dam bursting. Let her go. A man roared, his voice thick with fury. You're out of control. Another yelled, phones flashing like lightning in the growing dark. Then came Officer Ryan Carter, his boots pounding the pavement as he burst into the chaos. Younger than Jake, with a lean frame and a reputation for fairness. Ryan's sharp hazel eyes took in the scene in a heartbeat. Amelia clutching Ethan, her face etched with pain and defiance. Jake's rigid stance, his hands still hovering from the struggle. The crowd, bristling with outrage. What's going on here? Ryan demanded, stepping between them with a force that cut through the noise. She's resisting, Jake snapped, his grip on Amelia loosening before he let go entirely. I'm handling it. Ryan's gaze flicked to Amelia, her trembling son pressed against her, then back to Jake. This doesn't look like handling it, he said, his voice low and pointed. You need to back off. Jake's glare turned venomous, his jaw clenching so tight it seemed his teeth might crack. Don't tell me how to do my job, he hissed, stepping closer to Ryan. I will if you're stepping out of line, Ryan shot back, unflinching. Look around, Jake. This isn't going to end well for you. The two men faced off, the air between them electric with unspoken challenge. Amelia seized the moment to steady herself, her arm wrapping protectively around Ethan as she pulled him closer. "You okay, ma'am?" Ryan asked, his tone softening as he turned to her. She nodded stiffly, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I just want to get my son home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan nodded, then turned to Jake, his tone firm. "Let her go. She's not a threat." Jake hesitated, his eyes sweeping the crowd a dozen strong, their phones a silent jury. The weight of their witness, coupled with Ryan's steady presence, boxed him in. Finally, he stepped back, his glare lingering on Amelia like a promise of retribution. "This isn't over," he muttered, low enough for only her to hear. She didn't reply, just straightened her shoulders and turned away, Ethan clinging to her side as the crowd parted like a sea. Whispers of support trailed after her. "You're strong, Mama. We've got your back," a lifeline in the dark as she limped toward home. Ryan watched her go, then turned to Jake, his expression hard. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. Jake didn't answer, just spun on his heel and stalked off, his boots echoing into the humid night. The tension lingered, thick and unresolved. A lesson carved in the air: power unchecked breeds cruelty, but justice fragile, fleeting, can still rise from the ashes of defiance. The evening air hung thick and heavy, a storm brewing not just in the sky but in the hearts of those gathered on this restless street. Jake Peterson, his uniform taut across his broad shoulders, pivoted sharply, his boots scraping the pavement as he turned his focus toward Amelia. His voice rumbled low, a growl laced with unchecked frustration. "I'm not done here." With a dismissive shove, he brushed past Ryan, his fellow officer, who stood like a quiet sentinel amidst the rising chaos. Jake's strides were purposeful, each step closing the gap between him and Amelia, who stood rooted to the spot, clutching her young son Ethan to her chest. Her chin lifted, a defiant spark flickering in her eyes despite the tremor in her hands. She'd had enough anew of his barked commands, enough of his looming presence, but the words she wanted to hurl at him caught in her throat, tangled with fear and fury. Jake's face twisted, irritation carving deep lines into his brow. "I'm not taking orders from you," he spat, his tone venomous, dripping with disdain. His hand shot out, fingers clamping onto her shoulder with a force that sent her stumbling backward. Her sneakers skidded against the cracked sidewalk, her arms flailing briefly before she steadied herself. Ethan's small, frightened cry sliced through the tension, a piercing sound that made Amelia's heart clench. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice quivering, a raw blend of rage and desperation. She pulled Ethan closer, his tiny hands gripping her jacket as if she were his lifeline in this storm of aggression. Around them, the small crowd that had gathered swelled with outrage, faces flushed with indignation. They pressed closer, a sea of murmured protests rising into a wave of shouts. "Hey, back off," a burly man bellowed, his phone thrust forward like a weapon, its camera lens trained on Jake's every move. Another voice, sharp and incredulous, rang out, "What's wrong with you?" The murmurs crescendoed, a chorus of discontent spilling over the edges of restraint. People shifted on their feet, some craning their necks for a better view, others whispering to neighbors as the scene unfolded under the dim glow of streetlights. Ryan, his jaw tight and his eyes blazing with a fire born of disbelief, moved swiftly. He planted himself between Jake and Amelia, a human barrier against the escalating madness. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the din with the authority of someone who'd seen too much and refused to stand idle any longer. He wheeled on Jake, his gaze piercing. "What the hell is wrong with you? She's not a threat, Jake." His words trembled with a mix of anger and exasperation, as if he couldn't fathom how they'd reached this point. Jake's lips curled into a sneer, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "She's resisting," he snapped, his voice climbing higher, edged with a brittle defiance. He loomed closer, his shadow falling over Amelia, who stood her ground despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Protecting herself, Ryan shot back, his tone cracking like a whip. "You're out of line, and you damn well know it." His hands clenched at his sides, itching to do more than just talk, but he held firm, his resolve unshaken. Jake's sneer deepened, his lip twitching with contempt. "You don't get it. This isn't about hair, it's about maintaining control." His hand flexed near his utility belt, knuckles whitening against the dark leather, a silent threat hanging in the air. "No," Ryan countered, his voice sharp and unyielding, slicing through Jake's bravado. "It's about abuse of power. You're making this worse for all of us." His eyes darted to the crowd, to the phones glinting in the twilight, recording every word, every gesture. The weight of their scrutiny pressed down on them all, a tangible force that Jake couldn't ignore. For the first time, Jake faltered. His gaze flickered to the onlookers, their devices capturing the unraveling scene in real time. His chest heaved, breaths quickening as the reality of the moment settled over him like a leaden cloak. A voice pierced the clamor, bold and demanding. "What's his badge number?" Another joined in. Urgent and insistent. "We need to report this." The crowd surged forward, a restless tide fueled by frustration and a hunger for justice. Jake's face contorted, a mask of barely contained rage. "You people have no idea what you're talking about," he muttered, loud enough for the nearest ears to catch. His words were met with a swell of defiance, the crowd's murmurs morphing into a unified chant. "Let her go. This is harassment." Amelia, her hands still trembling as she held Ethan tight, found her voice amidst the chaos. "You're on notice now, Officer Peterson," she said, her words clear and steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "Everything you're doing is being recorded." Jake's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck bulging as his composure frayed. He took a step back, the pressure of the crowd and the unblinking eyes of their cameras chipping away at his resolve. Ryan seized the moment, his hand clamping onto Jake's arm with a firm, urgent grip. "Stand down." "Jake," he said, his voice low but laced with a warning, "before this blows up in your face." Jake shook him off, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with unspoken fury. "Don't tell me what to do, Carter," he snarled, but the fight in him wavered. The phones, the shouts, Ryan's unwavering stance boxed him in, leaving no room for escape. Finally, he stepped back, hands raised in a mocking gesture of surrender. "Fine," he spat, venom dripping from the word, "but this isn't over." He turned on his heel, stalking away, his every step radiating tension, a coiled spring ready to snap. Ryan didn't flinch. "It's over if I say it is," he called after him, his voice steady, a quiet promise woven into the words. The crowd's murmurs followed Jake's retreat, their anger simmering just beneath the surface, a pot threatening to boil over. Amelia, her knuckles white against the strap of her bag, held Ethan close, his small body trembling against hers. Ryan turned to her, his expression softening, the hard edges of his resolve giving way to concern. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, reflecting the streetlights like fractured stars. "I just want to get home," she whispered, her voice tight, barely holding together. Ryan glanced at the dispersing crowd, then back at her. "Let me walk you to your door," he offered, his tone kind but firm. "Just to make sure." She hesitated, then nodded, grateful for the small act of kindness amidst the storm. As they began to walk, the crowd thinned, their attention lingering on Jake's retreating figure, swallowed by the shadows of the night. The air remained heavy, thick with unresolved tension, a silent promise of more battles to come. Within the department, fractures deepened, Ejec's unchecked aggression clashing with Ryan's defiance, setting the stage for a reckoning that would test loyalties and unearth buried convictions. Amelia's grip on Ethan tightened, her every instinct screaming to shield him from the ugliness that had erupted around them. From down the street, the low rumble of an engine cut through the fading murmurs. A black pickup truck screeched to a halt, its tires biting into the asphalt. Marcus Bennett stepped out, his tall frame unfolding from the driver's seat, his face etched with confusion that quickly morphed into rising anger. He'd been on his way home from a long shift, his mind drifting to the comfort of his family, when he spotted the commotion and then his wife and son at its heart. "Amelia," his deep voice carried over the noise, a beacon of strength as he strode toward her, his boots pounding the pavement with purposeful urgency. Ethan's tear-streaked face sent a jolt of fury through him, his protective instincts roaring to life. "Marcus, no," Amelia said, her voice trembling as she reached out a hand to stop him. "It's under control, just go." But her words faltered, fragile against the storm brewing in his eyes. Jake's head snapped toward Marcus, his jaw tightening as he registered the new threat. "Stay back," he barked, raising a hand to halt him. "This is a police matter. You need to leave." His voice was a jagged edge, sharpened by the challenge to his authority. Marcus stopped short, his hands balling into fists, the muscles in his arms tensing beneath his jacket. "That's my wife and son," he said, his tone sharp, laced with barely restrained anger. "What the hell is going on here?" His eyes darted to Amelia, then to Jake, sizing up the man who dared lay hands on his family. "I said back off," Jake repeated, louder now, his patience fraying. "You're interfering with an active situation. Walk away, or I'll have you removed." Marcus squared his shoulders, taking a deliberate step closer, defying the order. "Removed for what?" "Being here for my family." His voice dripped with incredulity, his stance unyielding. "You think you can bully her because you've got a badge?" Jake's expression darkened, his authority teetering on the edge of collapse. "You're escalating this. Don't make me put you in cuffs." His hand brushed his belt, fingers grazing the cold metal of his handcuffs. Ryan stepped between them, his voice firm, cutting through the rising tension. "Jake, that's enough. This is already out of hand. Let's de-escale it." "De-escale it?" Jake snapped, his glare shifting to Ryan. "This guy's refusing a lawful order. He's pushing his luck." Marcus pointed a finger at Jake, his voice steady despite the fire in his chest. "You're the one out of line. I saw you shove her. You think we're just going to stand here and take this?" Jake lunged forward, closing the gap, his hand clamping onto Marcus's arm. "That's it. You're under arrest." Marcus twisted free, his voice sharp with warning. "Don't touch me." The crowd, now larger, roared in protest, their phones glowing like fireflies in the dusk. "This is wrong." One shouted, "Leave him alone." Another cried. Jake's patience shattered. He reached for his radio with one hand, the other going for Marcus again. "You're resisting," he growled. Marcus shoved his arm away, the two men locking eyes, inches apart, their breaths mingling in the charged air. Ethan's cry rang out again, and Amelia's voice broke as she pleaded, "Marcus, please stop." Tears streaming down her face. Before Jake could wrestle him down, Marcus braced himself, pushing back. They grappled briefly, a tangle of limbs and fury, as the crowd's outrage swelled. Ryan shoved himself between them, shouting, "That's enough. Jake, stop this now. You're making a scene." Jake, breathless and red-faced, barked, "He's under arrest for obstruction and assault." Ryan turned on him, his frustration boiling over. "The only one assaulting anyone here is you. Look at what you're doing." Jake hesitated, defiance warring with doubt as the crowd's chants grew louder. "Police brutality. We've got it all on camera." Marcus, chest heaving, locked eyes with Jake. "You think this ends here? I've got proof of what you're doing, and I'm not going anywhere." Jake sneered, his authority crumbling. "We'll see about that." He yanked his radio free, calling for backup. "One move, and you're spending the night in a cell." Ryan grabbed Jake's arm, his voice urgent. "Enough, Jake. Back off before this blows up in our faces." Jake yanked free, glaring. But the weight of the Momenthe cameras, the crowd, the unyielding truth forced him to retreat. His pride battered but his anger smoldering. In the aftermath, the lesson hung heavy. Justice wasn't just a badge or a tight light, was a fragile balance, easily tipped by those who wielded power without restraint. Jake's actions, born of a need to dominate, had ignited a fire that would burn far beyond this night, its consequences rippling through the department and the community. For Amelia, Marcus, and even Ryan, the fight was far from over, but it had exposed a truth. Unchecked power bred chaos, and the cost of its abuse would demand a reckoning. The night pulsed with an unrelenting energy, a storm of voices clashing against the thick, humid air. Amelia's heart thundered in her chest as she pushed herself forward, her legs trembling beneath her. Fear gnawed at her, but something fiercer, something protective rippled her through the chaos. Her voice, quivering yet piercing, sliced through the clamor like a blade. "He didn't do anything wrong," she cried, her shout reverberating over the sea of shouting faces. "This isn't just a site's harassment, pure and simple." Her words ignited the crowd, their collective roar swelling into a deafening crescendo. "Let him go," they bellowed, their voices raw with fury. "Do your job right for once. Jake, a broad-shouldered officer with a scowl etched deep into his features, stood at the center of the storm. His fingers twitched as he pulled the handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clink barely audible over the crowd's uproar. He stepped toward Marcus, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical, as if he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. But before he could close the distance, Rihanna, a younger officer with a lean frame and a flicker of doubt in his hazel eyes, thrust himself into Jake's path. His hand shot up, palm out, a fragile barrier between authority and chaos. "No," Ryan said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of unease. "Not like this. This isn't how it's supposed to go." Jake's eyes narrowed into slits, venom dripping from his words as he hissed, "Get out of my way." Carter, his breath was hot, his patience fraying like a worn rope. Ryan didn't flinch, though his pulse hammered in his throat. "I can't let you take this any further," he replied, his stance unyielding despite the tremor in his fingers. "It's over, Jake. Look at what you're doing." For a moment, Jake's hand hovered over the cuffs, the cold steel glinting faintly under the streetlights. His jaw tightened, indecision warring with his pride as the crowd's chants battered against him like waves against a crumbling cliff. Ryan's quiet resolve, paired with the unrelenting pressure of the onlookers, finally broke through. With a guttural growl of frustration, Jake stepped back, his shoulders slumping slightly. "This isn't over." He spat through clenched teeth, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned sharply, shoving his way through the throng, the crowd parting reluctantly as their anger trailed him like a shadow into the night. Amelia's knees buckled as the tension snapped, and she collapsed into Marcus's arms. Her sobs came in jagged bursts, muffled against the rough fabric of his jacket. Her hands clutched at him desperately, as if letting go might unravel everything she held dear. Beside her, Ethandhir's son, small and fragile at just 7 years old, pressed himself against them both, his tiny body shaking uncontrollably. His wide, tear-filled eyes darted between his parents, searching for reassurance amid the storm. Ryan stood a few paces away, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of what he'd just witnessed. His gaze softened as it settled on Marcus. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with regret and something unspoken. Marcus lifted his head, his dark eyes blazing with a fire that hadn't dimmed despite the chaos. Sweat glistened on his brow, streaking down his temple as he wiped it away with a trembling hand. "No," he said, his voice rough but resolute, "but we will be." The air crackled with an electric tension, the crowd's murmurs buzzing like a swarm of restless bees. Anger and disbelief mingled in their voices, a chorus of discontent that refused to fade. Amelia clung tighter to Ethan, her fingers brushing through his tousled hair as tears carved paths down her dirt-streaked cheeks. She couldn't stop trembling, her mind racing with images of what might have happened and what still might happen. Nearby, Jake Peterson lingered like a predator circling its prey. His hand rested on his radio, fingers twitching as if itching to call for reinforcements. His presence loomed over the scene, a dark silhouette against the flickering streetlights. Marcus caught his gaze and held it, a spark of defiance igniting within him. Raising his voice above the din, he shouted, "You think this ends here, Jake? You're wrong. I've got proof, documents, videos, everything. It's all there, showing exactly what you and your buddies in that department have been up to." Jake froze mid-step, his hand stalling over the radio. His eyes narrowed, suspicion and unease warring in his expression. "What the hell are you talking about?" he barked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus didn't hesitate, his words spilling out like a flood breaking through a dam. "You know exactly what I mean. Your abuse of power, the discrimination, the cover-ups. You've been gathering evidence for months. And I'm not alone. This isn't just about tonight. It's about every single time you've crossed the line and walked away clean." The crowd, already teetering on the edge, exploded with renewed vigor. Questions erupted from every corner, sharp, insistent demands for answers. "What kind of evidence?" A burly man in a worn jacket shouted, his voice hoarse from yelling. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" A woman near the front chimed in, her phone held high to capture the moment. The chant spread like wildfire. "We want the truth. We want justice." Jake's jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might shatter, He took a step closer to Marcus, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're bluffing. If you had anything real, you wouldn't be out here flapping your gums. You're just stirring up trouble." Marcus met his glare head-on, his own voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside him: fear, anger, and an unshakable determination. "Try me," he shot back, "because if anything happens to me tonight, everything I've got goes public. Every video, every name. You think you're untouchable. Think again." Amelia's voice shattered the standoff, sharp and desperate as she stumbled forward. "No, Marcus. Stop this," she pleaded, her sobs wrenching her apart as she reached for him. Her hands trembled violently, grasping at his sleeve. "Don't provoke him, please. Don't make this worse." Tears streamed down her face, her breath hitching as she fought to pull him back from the edge. But Jake ignored her cries, his focus locked on Marcus. He took a menacing step forward, his boots scuffing the pavement. "You're walking a fine line, Bennett," he snarled. "You think you're some kind of hero. You're nothing but a loudmouth with no respect for authority." Marcus squared his shoulders, his fists balling at his sides as he refused to back down. "Authority doesn't mean abuse," he fired back, his voice rising with conviction. "It doesn't give you the right to terrorize people, me wife, my son, anyone. You've been hiding behind that badge to hurt instead of protect, and I'm done letting it slide." Ryan, who had been watching from the sidelines, shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. His eyes flit between Jake and Marcus, then to the crowd, whose silent judgment bore into him like 1,000 needles. He'd been trained to stand by his partner, no questions asked. But every instinct screamed that this was wrong, terribly, irreversibly wrong. Finally, Ryan spoke, his voice tentative but growing stronger with each word. "Jake, maybe we should listen to him. Hear what he's got to say." Jake whirled on him, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "Are you serious right now, Carter? He's trying to whip this mob into a frenzy. Didn't you dare fall for it." Ryan hesitated, his gaze darting to Amelia and Ethan. He saw the raw terror in her eyes, the way Ethan clung to her skirt, his small hands shaking. Then he looked back at Marcus, whose defiance seemed to radiate a painful, undeniable truth. "What if he's not just stirring things up?" Ryan pressed, his voice firming as his own frustration bubbled to the surface. "What if he's right? We're supposed to stand for justice, not shut people down when it's inconvenient." Jake's glare burned hotter than ever, his words dripping with disdain. "You need to fall in line, Carter, right now. Don't make me question where your loyalty lies." Before Ryan could respond, Amelia lunged forward, her desperation boiling over. "You can't take him," she screamed, her voice cracking as she tried to reach Marcus. Jake intercepted her, shoving her back with a rough hand. The crowd gasped as she stumbled, her arms flailing to keep her balance. Ethan wailed, his cries piercing the night as he clutched at her, his tiny fingers digging into her skirt. "You're out of control," someone shouted from the crowd, their voice drowned out by the sudden flurry of phones rising to record the chaos. Ryan stepped closer to Jake, his voice dropping to a hushed, urgent tone. "This is wrong, Jake. Look around. Avirion's watching. You're only digging a deeper hole." Jake spun toward him, his breath ragged. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid. Think you're gonna play savior? Stay in your lane, or I'll make sure you regret it." Their eyes locked, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a battle between duty and conscience. Standing up to Jake could torch his career, but staying silent felt like a betrayal of every oath he'd ever taken. Amid the turmoil, Marcus raised his voice again, addressing the crowd with unwavering resolve. "What's happening here isn't new. It's been festering for years. People like Jake think they can get away with it because no one ever stands up. Well, I'm standing up now, and I'll make damn sure the truth comes out." The crowd erupted into cheers, their shouts of encouragement fueling Marcus's fire. Jake's face twisted with frustration, his grip on authority slipping through his fingers like sand. Amelia clung to Marcus's arm, her tear-streaked face a mask of dread. "Please, Marcus, let it go," she begged, her voice breaking. "They'll come after you. They'll come after us." Marcus turned to her, his expression softening for a fleeting moment. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle despite the storm raging around them. "I can't, Amelia." he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "If I don't fight this, it'll never stop, not for you, not for Ethan, not for anyone." Before she could protest, Jake grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him backward with a snarl. "That's enough out of you," he snapped, pulling out his cuffs again. "You're coming with me." The crowd roared in defiance, their voices crashing together like thunder. "Leave him alone," they shouted. "This is abuse. We're recording everything." Ryan stepped forward once more, his face pale but resolute. "Jake, stop. This isn't the way." Jake's head snapped toward him. "Back off. Carterum handling this," he barked. "No," Ryan replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You're making it worse. We need to step back before this spirals completely out of control." Jake glared at him, but for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty danced in his eyes. The crowd's chants grew louder, their cries for justice echoing through the street like a battle cry. With a final growl of frustration, Jake released Marcus, shoving him back. "Fine," he spat. "But don't think this is over, Bennett. You're on borrowed time." The crowd cheered as Marcus steadied himself, wrapping an arm around Amelia and Ethan, pulling them close. Ryan stepped back, his expression a tangled mess of relief and conflict as he watched Jake storm off into the night. For a brief moment, silence hung heavy over the scene. Then Marcus turned to Amelia, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm not stopping until this is exposed. The truth will come out." She nodded, though her eyes brimmed with worry, her hands still trembling as she held Ethan tight. Ryan lingered nearby, his conscience wrestling with his duty. He knew this wasn't the end, not for Marcus, not for Jake's unchecked aggression, and certainly not for the reckoning that loomed on the horizon. Later, under the harsh fluorescent glow of the precinct, the air buzzed with a different kind of tension. Officers clustered in tight knots, their hushed conversations sharp with judgment. Jake strode into the briefing room, his face a hardened mask, though he couldn't ignore the weight of their stares boring into him. The whispers fell silent as Ryan stepped in behind him, his footsteps hesitant. "Peterson." Lieutenant Roberts called from the head of the room, his voice clipped and authoritative. "We need to talk about what happened tonight." Jake moved to the center, squaring his shoulders as if bracing for a fight. "What's there to talk about?" He shot back, his tone defiant. "I handled a hostile situation, end of story. But it wasn't the end, not by a long shot." The lesson here stretched far beyond the chaos of that night. Justice wasn't a badge or a set of cuffs. It was a fragile, living thing, easily twisted by those who wielded power without restraint. Jake's actions laid bare the consequences of that abusive fracture in trust, a spark of resistance, and a community's demand for accountability. For Marcus, Amelia, and even Ryan, the fight was just beginning, a testament to the enduring truth that unchecked power, left to fester, would always face its reckoning. The stillness of the room shattered as Ryan's voice sliced through the air, sharp and unwavering. "That's not what happened, and you damn well know it." His words hung there, heavy with accusation, stirring an uneasy ripple among the gathered officers. Every eye darted toward Jake, whose frame stiffened instantly, his jaw locked tight, muscles twitching beneath the skin as he swiveled to face Ryan. "Careful, Carter," Jake growled, his voice low and edged with menace. "You're walking on thin ice here." The warning carried a weight that made the air feel colder. But Ryan didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed forward, his gaze burning with conviction. "You shoved in an armed woman and her kid, Jake." The crowd was ready to explode because of how you turned a spark into a wildfire. "If you can't see that, maybe that badge doesn't belong on your chest." A murmur rolled through the room like a gathering storm, voices blending into a chorus of whispered agreement and sharp dissent. The tension was palpable, a live wire crackling between the men. Lieutenant Roberts, seated at the head of the table, raised a weathered hand, silencing the chatter with a single gesture. "Enough," he said, his tone firm yet weary. "Peterson, Carter, sit down." Ryan lingered for a heartbeat, his chest rising and falling with restrained fury before he sank into his chair. Jake complied too, but his eyes never left Ryan, a smoldering glare that promised this wasn't over. "This is nothing but a witch hunt," Jake muttered, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, as if shielding himself from the room's judgment. I did what I had to do to keep things under control. Roberts leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His voice dropped, deliberate and heavy with authority. You're not the one under attack here, Peterson. But what you did tonight, it's dragged this whole department into the mud. Videos are already out there spreading like wildfire online. The public's howling for answers, and they're not wrong to demand them. Another officer, Martinez, piped up from the corner, his brow furrowed with unease. I've seen the footage, Jake. It's ugly. That family didn't deserve what you put them through. His words landed like a punch, and Jake's fists clenched on the tabletop, knuckles whitening. You're all so quick to point fingers, he snapped, his voice rising, but none of you were there. That guy, Marcus Benath, wasn't some innocent bystander. He was stirring up the crowd, pushing buttons. He's no victim. Ryan shot back, his tone cutting through Jake's defense like a blade. Even if he was, your job's to calm things down, not throw fuel on the fire. Jake let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and hollow. De-escalate. Spare me the rookie sermon. Carter, what have you got warriors on the force? You don't know what it's like out there, not really. The accusation ignited something in Ryan. He surged to his feet, slamming a hand onto the table with a force that rattled the room. What I know, he said, his voice trembling with rage, is that you crossed a line tonight. You didn't just hurt that woman, you made us all look like thugs in uniform. That's on you. Enough, Roberts barked, his command slicing through the escalating clash. He fixed both men with a stern, weary gaze, his face etched with the strain of holding this fractured unit together. This stops now. Both of you out. Ryan stood frozen for a moment, his breath ragged, before he turned sharply and stormed out, the door banging shut behind him. Jake stayed rooted to his spot, shoulders rigid, anger radiating off him in waves. Roberts turned to him, his eyes hard as steel. Peterson, you'd better start asking yourself if the way you're handling things is helping this departmenter. Tearing it apart, Jake didn't respond. He shoved his chair back, muttering curses under his breath as he strode out, the weight of the confrontation clinging to him like damp fog. In the hallway, he nearly collided with Officer Miller, a grizzled veteran whose clean public image masked a knack for turning a blind eye when it suited him. Jake, Miller said, his voice smooth but measured, we need to talk. Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Not now, Miller. I've got enough crap to deal with. Miller stepped closer, undeterred, his tone dropping to a near whisper. This can't wait. You're pulling too much heat. You know there are things in this department we don't want the public digging into. Jake stopped short, his brow creasing as suspicion crept into his gut. What's that supposed to mean? Miller leaned in, his breath warm against Jake's ear. It means if you keep making waves, you'll draw the wrong kind of icing tonight. On Bennett. On everything. There are people who don't want those questions asked. Jake's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the surface. You think I don't know how this game's played? I'm not some wide-eyed kid fresh out of the academy. Miller's eyes narrowed, his voice sharpening. Then stop acting like a liability. Because liabilities don't last long here. A thin, cold smile tugged at Miller's lips as he stepped back. Call it advice. Jake watched him walk away, a knot twisting in his stomach, tight and unrelenting. He'd always known the department ran on unspoken rules lines you didn't cross, secrets you didn't unearth. But tonight, those rules felt like chains, binding him to a system he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. He pushed through the bullpen toward his desk, the low hum of voices trailing him like shadows. Fragments of hushed conversations pricked his ears as he passed. Couldn't keep it together. If the captain catches wind of this, Carter's got a point. Each word sank into him, heavy as stones, piling onto the doubt already gnawing at his core. Slumping into his chair, Jake yanked out his phone, the screen lighting up with a flood of notifications. His inbox was a battlefield, tersely worded emails from brass, probing questions from reporters, and cryptic messages from faceless senders urging him to stay quiet. One stood out, bold and unblinking. Protect the shield, or you'll regret it. He slammed the phone down, the clatter echoing in the quiet space, frustration boiling over until it burned in his chest. For the first time, the lines between friend and foe blurred. Ryan's voice echoed in his skull. Your job is to de-escalate. But it was the faces of Marcus Bennett and his daughter Amelia that haunted him most vividly. Their wide, terrified eyes flickered in his memory, forcing him to confront a question he'd buried deep. Was he safeguarding the community, or just clinging to his own power? The precinct buzzed around him, louder than usual, every creak and murmur grating against his frayed nerves. Jake had always worn his no-nonsense reputation like armor, a badge of pride he'd forged over years on the beat. Now, that same toughness felt like a crack running through his foundation, threatening to split him apart. Later, when Roberts summoned him to his office, the lieutenant's expression was a storm cloud arc, unyielding and loaded with warning. Jake, he began, his voice steady but laced with gravity, you've got a choice to make. This mess isn't going away. You're either with us or you're against us. Jake straightened, his fists balling at his sides. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his tone flat, masking the turmoil churning beneath. Roberts didn't blink. It means a storm's brewing. Keep playing lone wolf, and you'll be the one caught in it. Jake left the office, his mind a whirlwind of clashing thoughts. He'd spent years believing in the system, its structure, its purpose, but now he could feel it buckling under its own weight. Was he defending justice, or just the men who twisted it for their own ends? The precinct's tension thickened with every passing hour, a suffocating fog he couldn't escape. Time was slipping away, and the pressure from his peers, the public, his own fractured conscience sackleston like a vice, threatening to crush him entirely. He was beginning to see it now. The very system he'd upheld was turning its teeth on him. The question loomed, vast and unanswerable. Would he stand by it, or risk everything to drag its shadows into the light? Alone in his dimly lit office, Jake sat with an envelope in his hands, its edges worn and creased from his restless grip. The precinct had fallen quiet, save for the faint hum of machinery droning in the background, a stark contrast to the chaos of his thoughts. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, as if it held the weight of his entire career. With a mix of dread and urgency, he tore it open, the sound of ripping paper unnaturally loud in the stillness. The name on the first page hit him like a freight train, Marcus Bennett. His eyes scanned the document, starting with the mundane of Marcus's address, his job, a sparse public record. But then, buried deeper, a name emerged that stopped his breath: Elijah Monroe. Jake froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. Elijah Monroe as mentor, his guide, a man whose integrity had once been a beacon in the murky waters of the force. Elijah had shaped him, taught him how to dig for truth, to treat people with dignity, to stand firm against corruption, and Jake had walked away from him. Memories surged up, sharp and unbidden, slicing through the years. He saw Elijah's calm, steady gaze, heard his deep voice laced with unshakable principle. Respect is earned, Jake, Elijah had told him once, his tone gentle but resolute. Fear's just a cheap shortcut. Back then, Jake had been a brash young cop, hungry for control, impatient with Elijah's measured ways. Their bond had fractured during a routine arrest gone sour, a petty scuffle. That Jake had escalated with a heavy hand. Elijah had confronted him afterward in the locker room, his voice low but piercing. "What are you doing, Jake?" That man was scared, not dangerous. You didn't have to make him a threat. "I was doing my job." Jake had shot back, defensive and bristling. He was resisting. Elijah's eyes had darkened with disappointment. "No, he was human, and you treated him like less. That's not Justicite's power." The argument had erupted, words flying like shrapnel, until Elijah's quiet final blow landed. "I thought I was teaching you better than this." He'd walked away, and Jake had let him, convincing himself that Elijah's ideals were relics, unfit for a world that demanded hard edges. Now, years later, the revelation in his hands rewrote everything. Marcus Bennett was Elijah's son. The realization crashed over Jake like a wave, pulling him under. His stomach churned as guilt and shame mingled with the echoes of Elijah's lessons. Marcus wasn't just a face in the crowd, it was a tether to the man Jake had once revered, the man whose principles he'd abandoned. The images of that night replayed in his mind, Marcus shielding Amelia, her small frame trembling as Jake's hands pushed them back, his voice barking commands. He'd seen defiance in Marcus's eyes, But now he wondered if it was fear for Elijah had once urged him to recognize. The lesson cut deeper now, sharpened by time and consequence. Justice wasn't about force, but about restraint, and power, unchecked, corrupted everything it touched. Jake leaned back, running a trembling hand over his face. The precinct's hum faded into a dull roar as he grappled with the truth. He'd prided himself on being a cop who got results, but at what cost? The system he'd served was a machine, grinding down those who questioned it, rewarding those who played its game. Miller's warning, Roberts's ultimatum were pieces of the same puzzle, a warning that power protected itself above all else. Jake's breath hitched as he stared at the torn envelope, the name Elijah Monroe staring back like a judgment. The lesson was clear, searing: abuse power, and it would hollow you out. Uphold justice, and it might cost you everything. The choice was his, and the clock was ticking. The air in the cramped room felt thick, oppressive, as Jake shoved his chair back with a violent scrape against the worn wooden floor. His chest heaved with every ragged breath, his boots thudding against the ground as he paced in tight, restless circles. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave, cold and merciless. What had he done? His voice slipped out, a hoarse whisper barely audible over the pounding in his ears. What the hell have I done? The words hung there, unanswered, taunting him as they echoed faintly off the peeling walls. The more he turned it over in his mind, the deeper the pit in his stomach grew. Everything Elijah, his former mentor, had instilled in him: honesty, integrity, the unyielding pursuit of what was right, Jake had twisted into something unrecognizable. He'd scoffed at fairness, dismissing it as a weakness unfit for the harsh realities of the world he'd chosen to navigate. His badge, once a symbol of protection, had become a blunt instrument in his hands, wielded with arrogance rather than care. And now, the bitter truth clawed at him. He'd hurt the very family of the man who'd once seen potential in him, who'd believed he could rise above the corruption that festered around them. His phone jolted him from his spiraling thoughts, buzzing insistently on the cluttered desk. The screen flared to life, casting a stark glow across the room, revealing a message from an unknown number. How does it feel to let him down? The words sliced through him, his blood turning to ice in his veins. Someone else knew Simeon out there was watching, judging. But who and how much did they understand of the tangled mess he'd made? His jaw clenched tight plus tight, the grinding of his teeth a futile attempt to anchor himself as his mind raced. A chaotic storm of fractured memories. The confrontation with Marcus in the street replayed in vivid detail, Marcus's voice raw with anger, his wife Amy stepping in front of their son, her eyes blazing with a mother's fierce protectiveness, and then Elijah's voice, steady and calm from years past, cutting through the noise. Choose the harder right over the easier wrong, Jake. Always. The lesson rang hollow now, a bitter reminder of how far he'd fallen. He yanked the file toward him again, fingers trembling as he flipped through the pages with desperate urgency. Among the scattered papers, a photograph slipped free, fluttering to the desk. Elijah, younger then, his face softened by a rare smile, cradled a small boy on his lap. Marcus, unmistakable even as a child, his wide grin a mirror of the man Jake had faced down in the street. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut, the resemblance a haunting echo of the legacy he'd betrayed. Elijah had been more than a mentor. He'd been a compass, guiding Jake toward justice, compassion, accountability. Triplestlin Jake had stomped into the dirt in his blind chase for power. Now, Elijah was gone, spared the agony of witnessing how thoroughly Jake had unraveled everything he'd stood for. With a surge of frustration, he slammed the file shut, the sound reverberating through the empty room like a gunshot. His hands shook, not just with anger, but with the weight of a truth he could no longer dodge. For years, he'd convinced himself that the ends justified the means, that bending the rules made him strong, effective a protector. But the evidence sprawled before him told a different story. He wasn't the guardian he'd painted himself to be. He was the tyrant Elijah had cautioned him against, the one who wielded authority like a club instead of a shield. Something deep within him fractured, a brittle piece of his pride splintering apart. It wasn't just guilt gnawing at him now, it was the sickening clarity that his entire sense of self had been built on quicksand, a lie he'd told himself to sleep at night. The badge pinned to his chest didn't confer honor, His actions did. And those actions? They'd been nothing short of ruinous. His thoughts drifted back to Marcus, to that explosive moment in the street. The fury in Marcus's voice hadn't been petty or aimless, it had been righteous. A fire kindled by betrayal and loss. The same fire Jake remembered in Elijah's eyes when he'd spoken of defending the defenseless. Marcus hadn't been picking a fight. He'd been shielding his own, just as Elijah always had. Jake sank forward, elbows on the desk, his head dropping into his hands. The weight pressed down on him, relentless. He couldn't erase what he'd done to Marcus and Amy, the humiliation. The fear he'd inflicted, he could stop the bleeding, stanch the wound before it deepened. Marcus had mentioned documents, evidence of something bigger, something rotten at the core of the department. Whatever they held could be the key to dismantling the corruption Jake had once ignored, maybe even abetted. But pursuing that truth meant torching the life he'd built, turning his back on the brotherhood he'd sworn to uphold. He pictured Elijah again, the man's steady gaze boring into him from across the years. What would he say now? Jake didn't have to guess, could hear it. Clear as a bell in the quiet. Do the right thing, Jake, even if it costs you everything. The words settled into him, heavy but resolute. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and reached for his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen, hesitation tugging at him. But he forced it aside and typed a message to Ryan, his partner of too many years. We need to talk. I think I've been wrong about everything. It wasn't much a pebble tossed into a raging river, but it was a beginning. Where it would lead, he couldn't say. But one thing was certain. He couldn't keep trudging down the same crooked path. Not after seeing the wreckage he'd left behind. Not after realizing he'd failed the one man who'd ever truly believed he could be better. The small meeting room at the community center buzzed with tension, the air thick enough to choke on. Marcus leaned against the edge of the table, his knuckles white where his fists pressed into the wood. His dark eyes locked on Jake with a volatile mix of suspicion and disdain. Across from him, Jake sat rigid, the badge on his chest feeling less like a shield and more like a millstone dragging him under. Between them lay the documents Marcus had risked everything to protect, crumpled pages, scribbled notes, a paper trail of corruption that could unravel the department. They sat untouched, a silent challenge neither man was ready to meet head-on. You expect me to believe you're on my side now? Marcus's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and jagged, honed by years of resentment. After everything you've done to my family. The accusation hung there, heavy with the weight of memory. Jake's voice barking orders in the street, the cuffs snapping around Marcus's wrists. Amy's cries as she clutched their son close. Jake didn't shrink from it, though guilt churned in his gut like a living thing. You think I don't know how bad I've screwed up, he said, his tone steady despite the storm inside him. I can't change what's happened, Marcus. But if we don't work together, those files vanish, and the people who've been tearing your life apart, they walk free again. Marcus let out a laugh, short and bitter, the sound scraping against the walls. The same system you've spent your career propping up, and now you suddenly give a damn? His words dripped with scorn, but beneath it, Jake caught a flicker of something else, pain, raw and unhealed. Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping low, urgent. I do give a damn, because I finally see what Elijah saw, what I was too stubborn, too blind to get until now. Those bastards aren't just your enemies, Marcus. They're mine too. Let me help, and we can take them down, together. Marcus's eyes narrowed, searching Jake's face for any hint of a lie, any crack in the facade. He wanted to believe him, God. Part of him ached, but the scars left by men like Jake ran deep, carved over years of broken trust and quiet betrayal. Before he could answer, the door flew open with a bang, and Ryan stumbled in, his face drained of color, his words tumbling out in a breathless rush. We've got trouble. It's them that are here. Jake's stomach plummeted, a cold sweat prickling his skin. How many? He demanded, already on his feet. 2 cars, at least 5 guys, Ryan shot back, his voice tight with panic. They're sweeping the building. They know Marcus is here. Marcus didn't hesitate. He snatched the documents, shoving them into his backpack with a practiced efficiency that spoke of too many close calls. We don't have time for this, he muttered, slinging the strap over his shoulder. If they get these, it's over. Jake's jaw tightened, resolve hardening in his chest. Not on my watch, he said, turning to Ryan. Get the staff outlock every exit except the rear. We'll use it as a fallback. Ryan faltered, his eyes darting between them. But he nodded and bolted from the room, his footsteps fading into the hum of chaos beyond the door. Why are you even still here? Marcus snapped, his glare cutting into Jake. You should be out there with them, covering for your buddies. Jake met his gaze, unflinching. Because I'm not one of them, not anymore. You don't have to trust me, but right now, I'm your best shot at keeping those files safe. Marcus's lip curled, a mix of frustration and grudging acceptance flickering across his face. He hated how much sense it made, hated the corner Jake had backed him into. This better not be another setup, Peterson, he growled, adjusting the backpack. The distant thud of boots echoed down the hall, growing louder, closer. Jake gestured sharply. Stay behind me, Marcus scoffed, shoving past him. I'm not hiding behind you. They moved fast, slipping into the hallway, the dim flicker of overhead lights casting long, jagged shadows. As they rounded a corner, a figure loomed ahead of Officer Carter, broad and menacing, his gun already drawn. Stop right there, he barked, his voice a guttural command. Jake stepped forward, hands raised, his tone deceptively calm. Easy, Carter. We don't need to do this. Carter sneered, his finger hovering over the trigger, his eyes glinting with malice. You think I don't know what you're up to, Peterson? Hand over the files, and we'll pretend this little betrayal never happened. Marcus shifted to the side, his stare locked on Carter, defiance blazing in his posture. You're not getting anything. Carter's lip curled into a snarl. You really gonna let this trash call the shots, Jake? Think about your career. Jake took a deliberate step closer, his voice hardening. My career was over the second I let you idiots run the show. I lost it. Now lower your weapon. The air crackled with tension, taut and ready to snap. Carter lunged, but Marcus moved like lightning, shoving Jake aside and slamming into Carter with the force of a freight train. The gun skittered across the floor as they grappled, a tangle of fists and fury. Another officer appeared at the hall's end, weapon raised, his face a mask of cold intent. Jake didn't think a dove for Carter's gun, rolling to his feet in one fluid motion and leveling it at the newcomer. Drop it, he shouted, his voice slicing through the chaos, sharp and unyielding. The second officer hesitated, distracted by the crack of Marcus's fist against Carter's jaw. Jake seized the moment, surging forward. With a quick twist, he disarmed the man, slamming him against the wall with a force that rattled the plaster. Marcus pinned Carter to the floor, his knee pressing into the man's chest. How many more are with you? He demanded, his voice like tempered steel. Carter spat blood, his defiance unshaken. You think this changes anything? We'll find you. We'll bury you. Jake loomed over him, his expression carved from stone. Not if we bury you first. He glanced at Marcus, urgency sparking between them. Let's move. They sprinted down the hall, the clamor of reinforcements closing in like a noose. They reached the rear exit, only to find it blocked to more officers, hulking silhouettes against the dim alley light. Stay here, Jake hissed, shoving Marcus into the shadows. What are you? Marcus started, but Jake cut him off, stepping into the doorway with his hands raised. It's me, Peterson, he called, his voice ringing with false confidence. I've got him cornered. He's got the files. The officers exchanged a quick, smug glance. Good, one said, lowering his weapon slightly. Let's take him in. Jake nodded, closing the distance. In a flash, he drove an elbow into the first officer's throat, sending him staggering back with a choked gasp. The second swung his baton, but Jake ducked low, sweeping the man's legs with a brutal kick that dropped him to the ground. Now, Marcus, Jake yelled. Marcus bolted past, bursting into the alley beyond, the backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Jake followed, his breath ragged, the night swallowing them as the sound of pursuit roared behind. The night clung to them like a damp shroud as Marcus's voice cut through the stale air, sharp with desperation. Ragged, where's Ryan? He twisted his head back, eyes darting over the shadowed figure of Jake trailing just behind. Jake's breath came in shallow bursts, his chest heaving as he shook his head, the motion heavy with uncertainty. I don't know, man, but we can't stop now, not with them so close. The words barely left his lips before their feet pounded against the cracked pavement, a frantic rhythm echoing through the narrow alley. Shouts erupted behind them, raw and guttural, the voices of pursuing officers slicing through the darkness like blades. Each yell tightened the knot in Marcus's gut, a visceral reminder of how little room they had left to maneuver. Jake took the lead, his lean frame weaving through the labyrinth of side streets with a precision that bordered on instinct. He knew this part of the city like the back of his hand, every rusted fire escape, every crumbling corner a map etched into his memory from years on the beat. His knowledge bought them fleeting seconds, precious gasps of time that kept the encroaching chaos at bay. The two men darted past overflowing dumpsters and flickering streetlights, the acrid stench of garbage mingling with the metallic tang of fear in the air. Finally, Jake jerked his head toward a dilapidated storage shed hunched behind an abandoned building, its warped wooden walls sagging under the weight of neglect. They slipped inside, the door creaking shut behind them, and collapsed against the splintered interior, their ragged breathing the only sound in the dim, musty space. As the adrenaline ebbed, Marcus whirled on Jake, his voice trembling with a cocktail of exhaustion and accusation. "Why didn't you just hand me over back there? It would have been cleaner for you-less mess to drag around." His eyes, wide and searching, bored into Jake, who met them with a glare that could have sparked a fire in the damp air. "I told you already," Jake growled, his tone low and taut. "I'm done dancing to their tune. This isn't just about you or me anymore, it's bigger. Those files, they're the key to tearing it all down. But only if we keep them out of those bastards' hands." His words hung heavy, a vow carved from years of buried frustration. Marcus hesitated, his jaw working as doubt wrestled with the faint flicker of trust Jake's resolve ignited. "If you're playing me," he started, but Jake cut him off, his voice a whipcrack in the stillness. "I'm not." The distant wail of sirens pierced the shed's thin walls, snapping them back to the present. Jake edged toward the door, peering through a jagged crack in the wood. "Coast's clear for now." "We need a plan," Marcus said, his tone steadier but still laced with urgency. Jake's gaze flicked to the battered backpack slung over Marcus's shoulder, the weight of its contents palpable even from across the shed. "First, we protect those files. Then we hit back hard." For the first time, Marcus glimpsed something raw in Jake's sincerity, unpolished and unguarded. It didn't erase the resentment churning in his chest, or the mistrust that clung to him like a second skin, but it was enough to tether them together, if only for the moment. Their fragile truce carried them to an abandoned safe house, a crumbling relic tucked away in the city's forgotten fringes. Inside, a single bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow over a scarred wooden table where Jake sat, hunched over the sprawl of documents Marcus had guarded with his life. Each page he turned deepened the furrow in his brow, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced lines of ink that spelled out betrayal. In stark black and white, reports of brutality, hushed-up scandals, and a web of corruption woven deep into the police force stared back at him, unblinking. Every sentence struck like a chisel against the fragile ideals he'd once held dear, splintering the illusions he'd clung to through years of wearing the badge. Across the room, Marcus leaned against the peeling wall, arms crossed tight over his chest, his posture a fortress of suspicion and scorn. "You look shocked," he said, his voice dripping with bitter amusement. "What's the matter, Jake? Didn't expect your precious system to be this rotten?" Jake didn't lift his eyes from the papers, but his silence spoke volumes, a man grappling with a truth he'd spent too long avoiding. "I didn't know it was this bad," he finally muttered, the admission tasting like ash on his tongue. Marcus let out a harsh, humorless laugh that ricocheted off the walls. "Didn't know, or didn't care to know. There's a difference, and you damn well know it." His words were a lash, each one stinging with the weight of lived experience. Jake slammed the papers down, the sound sharp in the stifling air, and met Marcus's gaze head-on. "I've seen things, ye hard rumors, whispers in the locker room. But this isn't just a few dirty cops. It's a machine, a network shielding itself for decades." He gestured wildly at the files, his voice rising with a mix of fury and disbelief. "Who else knows about this?" Marcus stepped forward, his expression hardening into something fierce and unyielding. "Not enough people, that's the problem. That's why I've been hauling these around, risking everything. My father, your mentor, Elijah, started this. He dug into it knowing it could kill him, knowing they'd hunt us down. Jake froze mid-pace, the mention of Elijah like a punch to the chest. He never told me, he said, his voice quieter now, threaded with regret. Marcus's eyes flashed. Would you have listened if he had? The question landed like a stone, sinking deep into Jake's conscience. He sank back into the chair, flipping through the pages again, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of a past he'd never fully understood. Marcus hesitated, then dragged a rickety chair across the warped floorboards and sat opposite Jake. He tapped the tattoo on his forearm, a stark design Jake now recognized from the files. A circle cradling a tree, its roots plunging deep, its branches straining upward. This, Marcus began, his voice softening but still edged with fire, isn't just some mark. It's a promise my family's carried for generations. Resistance against injustice, no matter what it costs us. Jake leaned closer, studying the ink with new eyes. What's it mean exactly? He asked, genuinely curious for the first time. Marcus's gaze drifted, lost in memory. The circle's unitus standing together. The tree's endurance, roots that won't break, branches that keep reaching. It's a reminder we're part of something that outlasts their pressure. My father lived that. He died for it. The weight of those words settled over Jake like a storm cloud, heavy and inescapable. And you're keeping it going, he said, more statement than question. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. Didn't have a choice. After Elijah was gone, someone had to. Jake rubbed his temples, exhaling a slow, shaky breath. This fight, it's personal for you. For your whole family. Marcus's voice rose, sharp and insistent. It's personal for a lot of families, Jake. You think me and Amelia are the only ones who've bled under this? Open your damn eyes. This system you've been propping up. It's built to grind people like us into dust. Jake's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists on the table. You think I don't see that now? Why do you think I'm still here? I could have bailed tonight. Let them take you down, but I didn't. Marcus's eyes narrowed, probing for weakness. And why not? Guilt, some shot at redemption, or just covering your own ass? The question sliced deeper than Jake cared to admit, peeling back layers of doubt he hadn't faced until now. He sighed, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. Maybe all of it. Maybe more. I don't know. But those files, they've got to see daylight. Marcus leaned in, his tone cutting. You're right. But daylight means a target on your back. You ready for that? Jake met his stare, unflinching, his resolve hardening like steel in a forge. I don't think I've got a choice anymore. Silence stretched between them, thick and electric, broken only by the faint hum of the city seeping through the cracked walls. It wasn't peace, but it wasn't war either, just a tentative bridge spanning the chasm of their mistrust. Jake rose again, sifting through the files with renewed purpose, his fingers pausing over a list of name-shy ranking officers tied to decades of abuse. One stood out, Captain Brooks. Brooks, Jake muttered, the name a bitter taste on his tongue. Marcus's face darkened, shadows pooling in the lines of his expression. You know him? Jake nodded, memories flickering like a faulty reel. Been with the force forever. Always untouch a blade of clean, to connected. Marcus cut in, his voice icy. He's not just an is running half of it. My father found proof before they got him. It's in there. Jake rifled through the stack, pulling out a faded letter in Elijah's cramped handwriting. It detailed clandestine meetings, cash-changing hands, cover-ups, roads leading back to Brooks. This could crack it wide open, Jake said, urgency igniting his words. Marcus's skepticism flared. And you think they'll just let you waltz in and spill it? Jake shook his head, a plan forming in the chaos of his thoughts. No, we leak it, media, community leaders, anyone who'll listen. If it's loud enough, they can't bury it. Marcus studied him, his face unreadable, weighing the risk against the faint hope Jake offered. You'd put yourself out there for that? Jake's voice turned to iron. I'm in too deep to turn back now. If I don't, who will? Another silence fell. But this one carried a shift no longer brittle with hostility. It hummed with cautious alliance. Okay, Marcus said at last, but this isn't just about exposing them. It's about shielding the people they've crushed. Amelia, Ethan, all of them. Jake nodded, his gaze steady. I'll keep them safe. You've got my word. A sharp knock shattered the moment. both men tensing like coiled springs. Jake signaled Marcus to stay quiet, his hand drifting to the holster at his side. "Who's there?" he barked. "It's me." Ryan's voice rasped through the door. Jake cracked it open, and Ryan slipped in, his face etched with grim lines. "They're combing the RER out of time." Marcus grabbed his bag, resolve hardening his features. "Then we move now." Jake's mind raced, strategies snapping into place. "We split up. Marcus, you hit the drop point. Get those files out. Ryan, and I will cover you." Ryan shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking between them. "And when they come for us?" Jake's expression turned to stone. "We deal with it whatever it takes." Marcus slung the bag over his shoulder, pausing at the threshold. "If you screw me," he started. But Jake cut him off, firm and final. "I won't." For the first time, Marcus offered a faint nod, not trust, not yet, but acknowledgement, and vanished into the night. As Jake and Ryan braced for the storm ahead, a single thought anchored Jake's mind. He'd finally chosen the right fight, but the cost might be everything he had left. Their actions rippled outward, a stone dropped in a still pond, stirring the corrupt officers into a frenzy of retaliation. The stakes climbed higher, the pursuit of justice a jagged path lined with peril, where every step forward demanded a reckoning with the consequences of power abused. The air in the precinct briefing room hung thick with unspoken resentment, a palpable bitterness that seemed to seep into every corner. Officers stood in tight-knit clusters, their hushed voices weaving a web of suspicion as they darted wary glances around the room. At the front, Captain Brooke loomed like a storm cloud, his broad frame radiating authority, his sharp eyes slicing through the tension to settle on Jake Peterson with icy precision. "We've been waiting," Brooks announced, his voice a low, frigid growl that sent a shiver down the spines of those nearest him. Jake squared his shoulders, his chest tightening with resolve as he stepped forward, each deliberate footfall echoing faintly against the scuffed linoleum floor. The long table stretched before him like a battle line, and as he approached, he could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, some complicit in the rot that festered within the department, others too paralyzed by fear to confront it. The walls, stained with years of neglect, seemed to lean inward, pressing against him as he sank into a chair. The air grew heavier, charged with the sting of accusatory stares that bore into him like needles. Brooks didn't waste a moment, his posture rigid as he launched into his attack. "You've been working against this department, Peterson, collaborating with the suspect. Care to explain yourself?" His tone was a blade, cold and cutting, designed to provoke. Jake's jaw clenched, a flicker of defiance sparking in his chest. "Collaborating," he shot back, his voice steady, but laced with barely contained outrage. "You mean trying to unearth the truth you've buried?" A murmur rippled through the room, a wave of unease that Brooks silenced with a single raised hand, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "Watch your tone," he warned, his words dripping with menace. "You're walking a dangerous line." Jake leaned forward, his palms pressing into the table as his voice grew firmer, unshaken. "Dangerous line? That's a bold accusation from you, Captain. I've seen the Felest cover-ups, the bribes. You've been shielding criminals, all while pinning that badge to your chest like it still means something." The room erupted in a chorus of gasps and sharp whispers, the tension snapping like a taut wire. Brooks' face darkened, his composure fracturing as he slammed a fist onto the table, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap. "Enough," he roared. "You don't have a clue what you're talking about." But Jake didn't flinch, his eyes blazing with conviction. "Don't I?" Elijah knew. He dug up the evidence, and now Marcus and I have it. You think you can bury me like you've buried everything else, but it's too late. The truth's already slipping through your fingers. Unease stirred among the officers. Some shifted in their seats, their boots scuffing the floor, while others crossed their arms, their expressions hardening into masks of defiance. Detective Monroe, a weary man with a perpetual sneer and unwavering loyalty to Brooks, shot to his feet, his voice dripping with venom. "You're a damn traitor, Peterson, siding with a criminal against your own. That's a disgrace." Jake's head snapped toward him, his glare fierce enough to cut through steel. "Disgrace? What's disgraceful is hiding behind your badge while you bully, blackmail, and ruin lives. Don't pretend you're blind to it, Monroe. the detective took a step closer. His frame coiled with aggression, his voice dropping to a guttural threat. "You're digging your own grave, Peterson. Keep pushing, and you'll be out of a job or worse." Jake surged to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, a jarring screech that matched the fire in his veins. "Go ahead. Try to intimidate me. I'm not backing down now, not ever." Brooks' voice sliced through the rising storm, sharp and laced with a chilling edge. "That's enough." He glared at Jake, his eyes narrowing into slits of barely restrained fury. "You think you're some kind of crusader. You're nothing but a liability. Keep this up, and you'll wish you'd never opened your mouth." Jake stepped closer to the table, his voice rising, raw with emotion. "You've already shattered enough lives, Captain. Marcus's family, Amelia, and God knows how many others. This department's supposed to uphold justice, but you've turned it into a swamp of corruption." Brooks leaned in, his face inches from Jake's, his breath hot with rage. "You don't know the first thing about justice. You're a fool if you think you can change a damn thing. This system's bigger than you, bigger than me. Keep rattling the cage, and you'll get torn apart." The room fell into a suffocating silence, Brooks' words lingering like a noose tightening around them all. From the shadowed corner, Ryan Carter, a young officer with a mop of unruly hair and a nervous twitch in his hands finally, broke the stillness. "Maybe Jake's right," he said, his voice trembling but resolute as every head swiveled toward him. "This department's broken. We've all seen it, felt it. How long can we keep pretending it's fine?" Brooks' glare shifted to Ryan, his lips curling into a snarl. "Careful, Carter. You don't want to flush your career down the drain over this." Ryan straightened, his shoulders trembling slightly, but his resolve firming. "I'd rather lose my badge than my soul." Jake's gaze flicked to Ryan, a spark of gratitude warming his chest amidst the chaos. He turned back to Brooks, unflinching. "Threaten us all you want, Captain. You can't stop what's coming. The evidence is out there, and soon everyone will see the truth." Brooks smirked, a cold, predatory glint in his eyes. "You're delusional, Peterson. You think anyone will buy your story. You're one man against a machine. You'll be crushed before you can scratch the surface." Jake's voice hardened, each word a hammer striking stone. "We'll see about that." Monroe lunged forward again, his anger barely leashed. "You think you're invincible. We'll destroy your career, your name, everything. Is that what you're chasing?" Jake stood his ground, his resolve unshakable. "If it means dragging the truth into the light, then yeah, it's worth it." The tension shattered like glass as Brooks straightened, his calm facade cracking to reveal the seething fury beneath. "You've made your bed, Peterson. Don't expect a lifeline when it all collapses." Jake's lips curled into a defiant smirk, his voice steady as steel. "I don't need your help, Captain. I've got the truth on my side. Let's see how far your threats carry you when the world sees what you've done." Brooks slammed his hand on the table one last time, a final, resounding crack that signaled the end. "Get out of my sight." Jake didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, his boots thudding against the floor as he strode out. Head high, every step a declaration of war. Ryan followed close behind, his face a storm of fear and determination, his breath uneven as they stepped into the cool night air outside the precinct. He glanced at Jake, his voice barely above a whisper. "What now?" Jake paused, casting a final look back at the hulking building, its windows glowing like the eyes of a beast. "Now we fight," he said, his tone resolute. "And we don't stop until this whole rotten system comes crashing down." The corrupt officers didn't waste time retaliating, their efforts to silence Jake and Marcus escalating with ruthless precision. Marcus moved through the shadowed streets, a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder, its contents damning evidence of the department's sins pressing against his side like a lead weight. The dim streetlights cast long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement, and every rustle of leaves, every distant clatter, set his nerves alight. He reached the corner near the community center, a dilapidated brick building with flickering lights, and paused, his eyes scanning the darkness. He'd been tailed before, felt the prickle of unseen eyes, but tonight the danger pulsed closer, a living thing stalking him through the silence. The sudden roar of an engine shattered the stillness, a black SUV tearing around the corner and screeching to a halt mere feet away. For men spilled out, their plain clothes doing little to mask their intent, their movements sharp and predatory. Hand over the bag, the leader barked, a stocky figure with a scar slicing across his brow, advancing with a purpose that made Marcus's stomach twist. He stepped back instinctively, his fingers tightening around the strap. "You're not getting it," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "Not tonight. Not ever." The leader's smirk was a twisted thing, cold and cruel. "You think you're walking away from this? We know what's in that bag, and we're not leaving empty-handed." Before Marcus could respond, one of the men lunged, his hands clawing for the prize. Marcus twisted away, his elbow crashing into the man's jaw with a sickening crunch. But the others swarmed in, a blur of fists and fury. The street erupted into chowshouts ricocheted off the buildings. Fists flew in wild arcs, and Marcus fought with a desperation born of knowing what hung in the balance. He was outnumbered, his strength waning, and just as one of the attackers tore the bag from his grasp, the screech of tires cut through the madness. Jake Peterson leapt from his car, gun drawn, his face a mask of rage and resolve. "Back off!" His voice cracked through the night like a whip, freezing the men in their tracks. They turned toward him, the leader's sneer deepening. "Peterson, you really want to sink with him? Step aside." Jake didn't waver, his grip on the weapon steady. "You want that bag? You'll have to go through me." The air thrummed with tension as the men hesitated, their eyes flickering between Jake and the prize. Then one charged, and the standoff exploded into motion. Jake's fist slammed into the man's stomach, sending him staggering back with a guttural wheeze. Another attacker lunged, but Jake sidestepped, driving a sharp blow into his ribs. Marcus, scrambling to his feet, dove back into the fray, tackling a third man who reached for the bag. The fight was a brutal symphony of survival. Jake ducked as a crowbar whistled past his head, retaliating with an uppercut that sent his assailant sprawling. Marcus wrestled the bag free, using it to block a punch, his breath ragged but his determination unbroken. "You should have stayed in your lane, Peterson," one of the men snarled, swinging a pipe that Jake narrowly dodged, countering with a kick that sent the weapon skittering across the pavement. "Maybe you should have learned what justice really means," Jake shot back, his voice a growl. Side by side, they fought a chaotic dance of grit and defiance. Marcus shoved one attacker into a rusted dumpster, the clang echoing through the night, while Jake pinned another against a brick wall, his forearm digging into the man's throat. "Who sent you?" Jake demanded, his tone sharp as a blade. The man thrashed, silent and defiant, and Jake shoved him aside, his focus snapping back to the fray. Seeing their plan unravel, one of the attackers snatched the bag and bolted, his boots pounding the pavement. Marcus's shout tore through the air. "Jake, he's got it." But the fight wasn't over yet. The lesson was clear: power abused bred consequences, and justice, though battered, refused to stay silent. The chase erupted with a fierce urgency as Marcus tore after the man clutching the bag, his boots pounding the cracked pavement of the city's forgotten corners. Jake, his partner in this chaotic pursuit, stayed hot on his heels, his breath sharp and determined. The narrow alleys twisted like a labyrinth, lined with rusted chain-link fences and crumbling brick walls, the air thick with the stench of decay and desperation. The man ahead darted through the maze, his movements frantic yet calculated, dodging overturned trash cans and leaping over piles of debris in a bid to shake his pursuers. Marcus felt his chest tighten, each ragged inhale burning his lungs as he pushed his body to its limits, closing the distance step by grueling step. Sweat stung his eyes, but he refused to falter. Too much was at stake. Jake, ever the tactician, veered off into a shadowed side alley, his instincts sharp as a blade. His boots splashed through puddles of stagnant water as he raced to outmaneuver their quarry. Emerging just as the man rounded a corner, Jake launched himself forward with a predator's precision, slamming into the runner and sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The bag, black, worn, and heavy with secret, slid across the pavement with a harsh scrape, coming to rest against a graffiti-covered wall. "End of the line," Jake snarled, his voice low and guttural as he pinned the man beneath his knee, his hands gripping the runner's wrists with unyielding force. The man squirmed, his face contorted in a mix of fear and defiance, but Jake's weight held him fast. Marcus arrived moments later, his chest heaving as he scooped up the bag and clutched it to his chest like a lifeline. "We've got it," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion seeping into his bones. His dark eyes flicked up as the sound of footsteps echoed through the LA3. More figures emerged from the gloom, their faces twisted with rage and desperation. One of them, a weary man with a scar slicing across his cheek, stepped forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're making a big mistake, Peterson," he spat, his tone dripping with venom. "This isn't over." Jake rose slowly, his movements deliberate as he drew his gun and leveled it at the group, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Walk away while you still can," he warned, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip. For a heartbeat, the men bristled, their fists clenched as if daring fate to intervene. But something in Jake's iced glint of resolve, the promise of consequence, made them falter. With a string of muttered curses, they retreated, melting back into the shadows like phantoms. Marcus slumped against the nearest wall, his shoulder pressed to the cold brick as he fought to steady his breathing. "That was too close," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. Jake nodded, his expression grim, the lines of his face etched deeper by the weight of the night. "They're not going to stop," he said, holstering his weapon with a practiced motion. "We need to get this to someone we can trust." "No." Marcus straightened, his grip tightening on the bag as a name surfaced in his mind. "I know just the person," he replied, his tone resolute despite the ache in his limbs. Together, they navigated the winding streets, the city's pulse thrumming around them, car horns blaring in the distance, the faint wail of a siren rising and falling like a mournful cry. Their destination was a modest house on the edge of town, its porch light casting a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a retired judge whose name carried the weight of decades of integrity, lived there, a beacon of hope in a world too often shrouded in corruption. Jake lingered outside, his eyes scanning the street as Marcus stepped onto the creaking porch and knocked. The door opened to reveal Eleanor, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her sharp eyes softening as she recognized Marcus. He handed her the bag, his hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. "These documents need to see the light of day," he said, his voice firm yet laced with a quiet plea. "They expose everything: bribery, coercion, abuse of power. It's all here." Eleanor took the bag, her fingers brushing the worn fabric as she nodded solemnly. "I'll make sure they do," she promised, her tone carrying the gravity of a vow. "You've done the right thing, Marcus." Jake slipped inside moments later, his broad frame filling the doorway as he joined them. His face was a mask of stoicism, but beneath it churned a storm of doubt and determination. "This isn't just about the evidence," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "We need to make sure those men and everyone they're shielding face the consequences. Justice has to mean something." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm yet comforting, like an anchor in turbulent waters. "We'll take it step by step," she assured him. "The fight's just beginning, but what you've done tonight, it matters." As they left her home, the weight of their actions settled over Marcus and Jake like a heavy cloak. The streets were quiet now, the first hints of dawn streaking the sky with pale gold. "We bought ourselves some time," Marcus said, his voice tinged with cautious relief. Jake's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "They'll come at us harder now. We need to be ready." Their small victory tasted bittersweet, a fleeting glimmer of triumph in a war that promised only greater battles ahead. Neither man would back down, though. The stakes were too high, and the faint promise of hope on that distant horizon was worth every risk. Days later, Jake found himself standing on the weathered front steps of Marcus and Amelia's home, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged beast. The past weighed on him, years of wielding power recklessly, of letting prejudice twist his judgment, of inflicting wounds he could never fully heal. He raised his fist and knocked, the sound sharp against the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing Amelia, her frame rigid with exhaustion and defiance, her brown eyes narrowing as they met his. Behind her stood Marcus, his presence a quiet storm, his gaze hard and unforgiving. "What do you want, Jake?" Marcus asked, his voice clipped, each word a shard of ice. "I need to talk," Jake began, forcing his tone to remain steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. Not as an officer, as a man who knows he's screwed up. Amelia crossed her arms, her stance a fortress of skepticism. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here after everything you've done, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Jake nodded, accepting the venom without flinching. I deserve that. I'm not expecting forgiveness, not now, maybe not ever. But I need you to hear me out. Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line, her hesitation palpable. But after a long moment, she stepped aside, letting him in. Marcus followed, his silence a warning. His broad shoulders squared as if ready to intervene at the slightest misstep. In the cramped living room, surrounded by faded furniture and the faint scent of coffee, Jake took a deep breath, the air heavy with the ghosts of his mistakes. I was wrong, he said, his voice firm yet raw. I let prejudice blind me. I let power twist me into something I didn't recognize. I hurt you. Amelia, I hurt your family, and I'm sorry. It's not enough, I know that, but it's the truth. Amelia's eyes narrowed, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. Sorry doesn't undo the trauma, she shot back, her voice trembling with the weight of memory. It doesn't erase what you did to me in front of my son, me little boy watching his mother humiliated, terrified. You don't get to just walk in here and wipe that slate clean. Jake lowered his head, guilt carving lines into his weathered face. You're right. It doesn't erase anything. I can't undo the past. I'm not here to try. I'm here to own it, to take responsibility, and to make things right however I can. Marcus stepped forward, his arms crossed, his tone cutting through the room like a blade. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Words are cheap, Jake. We're still living with the wreckage you left behind. Jake met his gaze, unflinching despite the shame gnawing at him. I've started exposing the corruption in the department, he said. It's not just about me anymore, it's about tearing down a system that's crushed too many people. For too long. I'm risking everything to do it. Amelia took a step closer, her voice steady but heavy with unspoken pain. You want to make things right. Prove it. Prove you're not just another cop scrambling to save his own skin. Show me day by day that you mean this. Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. You have my word, and I'll back it up with action. I won't stop until the truth's out and every last one of them pays for what they've done. Amelia held his stare, searching his face for any hint of deceit. Words are easy, Jake, she said finally. What you did to me, to us, there's no quick fix. If you're serious, you'll have to earn every shred of trust back, and even then, it'll never be what it was. Her words hung between them, a challenge and a warning. I understand, Jake replied softly, and I'm ready for that. In the weeks that followed, an uneasy alliance formed between Jake and Marcus. They worked side by side, their partnership a fragile thread stretched taut by mistrust. Jake leveraged his insider knowledge, quietly gathering damning evidence from within the department: audio recordings, falsified reports, names of those who'd turned justice into a weapon. Marcus, meanwhile, rallied a network of community ally shopkeepers, teachers, activists while safeguarded the growing pile of proof, their loyalty forged by years of shared struggle. The tension between the two men crackled like static. Marcus often prodded Jake, his questions sharp and probing. Why now? He demanded one evening as they pored over a stack of incriminating files in Marcus's dimly lit kitchen. Why fight the system you spent years propping up? Jake leaned back, the wooden chair creaking under his weight, his eyes distant. It's not sudden, he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. It's been eating at me for a long time, every wrong call, every abuse I ignored. I just didn't have the guts to face it until now. Marcus snorted, his skepticism a tangible force. Courage, hub, easy to find when you've got nothing left to lose. The words hit Jake like a punch. Raw and true. Yeah, he conceded, I'm at rock bottom. But that's why I've got no choice but to climb out, and I'm starting by doing what's right. Slowly, Jake's actions began to outweigh his promises. He stood beside Marcus at community gatherings, his presence a silent pledge as they unveiled evidence to trusted leaderspeople like Mr. Carter, a grizzled mechanic with a voice like gravel, and Ms. Lena, a school teacher whose quiet strength commanded respect. At one meeting, a young activist named Tariq confronted Jake, his anger blazing. Why should we believe a word you say? You were part of the problem. Jake didn't flinch, his voice steady. I was. I can't rewrite that. But I'm here now because I want to be part of the fix. Doubt me all you want, he'll keep showing up until you don't have to. Marcus watched, his hard edges softening just a fraction. Trust remained a distant shore, but he couldn't deny the flicker of sincerity in Jake's persistence. Amelia, though, held her ground like a sentinel. She saw Jake's efforts every late night, every risk he took, but her wounds ran too deep for easy absolution. One afternoon, after a meeting at the community center, Jake approached her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I know I've hurt you more than I can ever repay, he said, his voice low and earnest. But I hope someday I can earn even a sliver of your trust. Amelia's response was blunt, her eyes locking onto his. Trust isn't handed out. Jake's built. Right now, you're still standing in the ruins of what you destroyed. Keep working. Maybe one day you'll lay a foundation worth something. Her words ignited a fire in him, stoking his resolve to press on. As Jake dug deeper into the department's rot, the backlash grew fierce. Anonymous threats piled up, late-night calls with distorted voices. Notes slipped under his windshield wipers, promising retribution. His old comrades turned on him, their sneers branding him a traitor. One night, he returned home to find his door ajar, the lock splintered. Inside, his living room lay in chouse books torn from shelves, cushions slashed. A message scrawled in red paint across the wall, "Back off." Fear clawed at him, but it only sharpened his defiance. He called Marcus that night, his voice a steel thread. "They're trying to break me, but I'm not stopping it now, not ever." Marcus's response was measured, a rare note of solidarity breaking through. "Just remember, Jake, you're not alone in this anymore. We're in it together." The fragile bond between them hardened, forged in the crucible of their shared mission. Amelia watched from the sidelines, her trust a slow thaw, her heart still guarded. As new evidence surfaced, names, dates, deals that stretched into the city's highest-ranked stakes soared. Justice, they all knew, was a brutal teacher. It demanded sacrifice, exposed weakness, and punished those who wielded power without care. For Marcus, it was a fight for his community's soul. For Jake, a reckoning with his own. The road ahead loomed dark and treacherous, but together they faced it unyielding, unbroken, and driven by the unshakable belief that even the smallest acts of courage could tip the scales toward a brighter dawn. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jake stood outside the precinct, the crisp March air biting at his skin, carrying with it a clarity that pierced through the fog of his past regrets. The parking lot stretched before him, a barren expanse of cracked asphalt that had once echoed with the easy laughter and banter of his fellow officers. Now it was a battlefield of silence, the weight of it pressing down on his chest like a physical force. His boots crunched against the gravel as he shifted his weight, feeling the hostile eyes of passing colleagues darting away in cold indifference, others lingering with sharp, accusing glares. He was no longer one of them, no longer part of the brotherhood he'd once clung to for identity. The sting of their rejection twisted in his gut, but beneath it burned a quiet resolve. This was his road to redemption, a path riddled with thorns and shadowed by doubt, yet one he was ready to tread with unwavering determination. Change was a brutal, uphill climb, but Jake knew it was possible, had to believe it was, or everything he'd sacrificed would crumble to ash. Inside the station, the air was thick with tension, a low hum of whispers trailing him as he walked past rows of desks cluttered with coffee mugs and paperwork. The hostility wasn't loud or brash. It didn't need to be. It hung in the space between words, in the way heads turned just slightly away, in the way fingers paused over keyboards as he passed. He was a pariah now, a man who'd dared to lift the veil on the corruption festering within these walls. Each step echoed in the tiled hallway, a reminder of the isolation he'd chosen when he'd decided to stand for truth. His chest tightened with the weight of it, but he squared his shoulders and pressed on. Justice, he thought, wasn't about comfort, it was about consequence, about facing the fallout of doing what was right, no matter how much it cost. Yet amidst the cold shoulders and veiled threats, a flicker of unexpected support emerged. Marcus, a man who'd once viewed Jake with thinly veiled contempt, had begun reaching out more often. Their conversations were still jagged, laced with the tension of old wounds and unspoken grudges. But beneath the surface, something fragile was taking root, a tentative trust, like the first green shoot breaking through frozen soil. One evening, Jake found himself stepping into the community hall, a modest brick building bathed in the golden glow of dusk. The room buzzed with restless energy, packed with residents whose faces were etched with curiosity and skepticism. Marcus stood near the front, his broad frame tense but steady, while Amelia lingered off to the side, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes tracking Jake's every move. The weight of his uniform felt heavier than ever, its starched fabric a stark contrast to the worn jeans and faded shirts of the civilians around him. He took a deep breath, the air tasting faintly of dust and old wood, and stepped up to speak. "I was part of the problem," Jake began, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. It trembled only slightly, though his heart pounded against his ribs as if trying to break free. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment, turned a blind eye when I should have looked harder. I failed y'all of you. But I'm here now, standing before you, ready to fix what I helped break. No matter how long it takes, or how much it costs me." The confession hung in the air, raw and unpolished, and for a moment, the room was so silent he could hear the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet. Amelia's expression remained guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line, but there was a flicker in her eyes, doubt warring with the tiniest spark of belief. She hadn't forgiven him, not yet, and Jake didn't expect her to. Forgiveness was a luxury he hadn't earned, but her presence, her quiet observation, told him she couldn't fully dismiss the shift she saw in him. Then a voice sliced through the stillness, rough and edged with years of frustration. "Why should we trust you, Jake? You're still wearing that badge, the same one that's crushed us under its heel for decades." The man who spoke was weary, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a threadbare jacket, his dark eyes blazing with a challenge. Jake met his gaze, unflinching, though the words landed like a punch to the gut. "You shouldn't," he replied, his tone steady but laced with humility. "Not yet. Trust isn't something I can demand, it's something I have to prove, step by step, day by day. I'm here to earn it, however long that takes." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some heads nodding reluctantly, others still hardened with doubt. But the evidence Marcus had painstakingly gathered, dog-eared documents, and grainy photos exposing decades of rot within the police force, began to spread like wildfire. Local journalists seized the story, their headlines screaming of corruption and betrayal, while the papers implicated not just foot soldiers like Jake had been, but the brass at the top. The department had no choice but to launch an internal investigation, though everyone knew it was a reluctant, grudging move. Outside, the city erupted. Protests swelled in the streets, voices rising in a chorus of anger and hope, demanding transparency, demanding reform. At the heart of it stood Marcus and Jake, an unlikely pair bound by a shared mission that neither had foreseen. During one such protest, as dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a young officer named Ryan approached Jake. His uniform was crisp, his face still boyish despite the lines of conflict etched into it. "I saw the reports," Ryan said, his voice low, almost lost in the chants echoing around them. "You were right to expose them. I just wish I'd had your guts sooner." Jake studied him, seeing the flicker of shame in the younger man's eyes, and offered a small, tired nod. "It's not about guts, Ryan. It's about doing what's right, even when it rips everything you know apart. Courage comes after, when you're already into deep to turn back." Ryan swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting at his sides, and Jake saw a spark of something new in him, a resolve that hadn't been there before. Later that night, Marcus's voice crackled through the phone, urgent and rough with exhaustion. "The department's leadership is cracking, Jake. Your testimony, those documents, they're forcing changes we never thought we'd see." Jake leaned against his kitchen counter, the cool edge of the granite grounding him as a wave of relief washed over him, fleeting but real. But Marcus wasn't done. "This is just the start, though. There's a mountain of mess left to shovel." They met again at the community hall, the same worn chairs now occupied by a smaller, quieter group, fewer in number, but their faces carved with a steely determination. Marcus took the floor, his deep voice filling the space. "None of this would have happened without everyone in this room. But we can't let up now. This fight's got a long way to go. Jake stepped up beside him, the weight of their shared struggle settling into his bones. It's going to take all of us, he added, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. And it's going to take time, but we're in it together. Back at the precinct, the retaliation came swift and sharp. Anonymous notes slipped into his locker, their scrawled warnings dripping with venom. Keep your mouth shut, traitor. His patrol assignments grew darker, more dangerous, sending him solo into volatile corners of the city where backup was a distant dream. One night, under a sky heavy with clouds, Jake trudged to his car, his breath fogging in the chilly air. He stopped short, his stomach twisting as he saw the slashed tires. The word traitor etched into the paint with a jagged edge. Fury surged through him, hot and wild, his fists clenching until his knuckles ached. But he didn't lash out. Instead, he closed his eyes, drew a slow, shuddering breath, and dialed Marcus. "They're not stopping," he said, his voice tight. "They're trying to break me." Marcus's reply came steady and unyielding. "Let them try. They can't bury the truth. Stay sharp, Jake. We're in this together." Despite the pushback, glimmers of progress emerged. New policies trickled in, aimed at rooting out bias and holding officers accountable. Community leaders, their voices hoarse from years of shouting into the void, began working alongside a handful of reform-minded cops. At one meeting, Jake sat in the back, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as residents aired their grievance stories of harassment, of betrayal, of loss. Amelia stood at the far end of the room, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on him. When the last speaker sat down, she approached, her footsteps soft against the linoleum. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it, a thread of warmth woven into the caution. Jake nodded, his throat tight. "Still a long way to go." She tilted her head, considering him. "Yeah, but maybe there's hope." It wasn't absolution, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall between Thema beginning. Months rolled by, and the fight wore on. Jake's career as he'd known it was a shattered relic, his name a curse among his old colleagues. But in the community's eyes, he was slowly becoming something else, an ally, flawed and scarred, but real. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he and Marcus sat on the chipped steps of the community hall, the city sprawling out before them. Marcus broke the silence, his voice gruff. "Ever think about walking away, leaving this whole mess behind?" Jake shook his head, his gaze fixed on the flickering lights in the distance. "Not anymore. I've got too much to atone for." Marcus studied him, then nodded, a rare flicker of respect in his eyes. "Good. 'Cause we're gonna need you when the next storm hits." Jake smirked, a brief flash of lightness cutting through the weight. "I'll be ready." Driving home that night, the city's glow stretched out like a fragile promise. The war against corruption and prejudice was far from won, its battles stretching endlessly into the future. But for the first time, Jake felt a purpose that dwarfed his guilt, a fire that burned brighter than his mistakes. Each small victory, each hard-won step, was a brick laid on the path to redemption. The road was long, treacherous, and uncertain, but he wasn't alone. Marcus, Amelia, and the community were his anchors, his guides, pulling him toward a version of himself he could finally believe in. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a struggle, a reckoning with power's consequences, and Jake was ready to face it, no matter what lay ahead. On a crisp afternoon, Elijah Brooks sat in his car, the engine still silent, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Today was no ordinary day for him, was about to be celebrated. For over 25 years of flawless service in the United States Navy, despite running slightly behind schedule, a rarity for a man of his discipline, Elijah's demeanor remained steady, unshaken. He had always been this way, a figure of focus and restraint, his emotions locked tightly beneath a surface of calm resolve. Yet, as he lingered there, something gnawed at him, a faint, unplaceable unease that hovered like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He tilted his head toward the rearview mirror, fingers adjusting the knot of his tie with meticulous care. The reflection staring back was pristine, his uniform crisp and impeccable, a testament to the leader he had become. He wasn't dressing for the approval of the high-ranking officers and political dignitaries who would soon surround him. This was simply who he was, a man who carried himself as an example, a beacon of order in a chaotic world. Just as he reached for the ignition, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A patrol car rolled to a stop beside him, its tires crunching softly against the asphalt. Elijah's gaze followed the officer as he emerged, stepping out with a deliberate slowness that seemed almost performative. The man adjusted his belt and holster with exaggerated care, his posture stiff, his hand lingering near his weapon as if to announce his presence. Elijah let out a quiet sigh. He knew this type all too well: rigid stride, the puffed-up aura of control. Over decades of service, he'd crossed paths with countless men like this, their authority worn like a badge of superiority rather than a tool for justice. "Good afternoon, officer," Elijah said, rolling down his window with a measured calm that belied the tension creeping into the air. "Is there a problem?" The officer, whose name tag read Randy, didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there, his sharp eyes raking over Elijah with a scrutiny that felt like a challenge. Inside Randy's mind, a storm brewed not of reason, but of something darker. A need to assert dominance over this man who sat so composed in his pristine uniform. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Randy finally asked, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, hard and unyielding. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his tone steady but firm. "Parked, waiting to get on my way." "Why do you ask?" "You look out of place," Randy replied, his words dripping with intent. Brushing aside Elijah's politeness as if it were irrelevant, he shifted his weight, hands resting on his belt. The gun at his side gleaming in the afternoon light, a silent threat made glaringly obvious. For a moment, Elijah studied him, his mind racing to assess the gravity of this encounter. He'd seen situations like this spiral before, knew how quickly a spark could ignite into something uncontrollable: license, registration, and ID. "Now," Randy ordered, his voice clipped, leaving no room for negotiation. Elijah's chest tightened, but his face remained a mask of composure. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the glove compartment, every movement calculated under Randy's watchful glare. He retrieved his driver's license and, with it, his military ID, sliding them across the console. "I'm Commander Elijah Brooks, an officer in the United States Navy. I'm on my way to a military event. Here are my documents." Randy snatched the papers, but his eyes didn't even flicker toward them. Instead, he crossed his arms, his stance widening as if Elijah's rank meant nothing to him. "Commander, huh? And what exactly brought you to this neighborhood? Looking for something, maybe?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, and Elijah's tone sharpened, though he kept it controlled. "Officer, I'm trying to understand where you're going with this. I'm fully aware of my rights, and so far, you haven't given me a clear reason for this stop." Randy's lips curled into a faint smirk, his hand drifting back to rest on his weapon. "I give the orders here, Mr. Brooks," he shot back, deliberately stripping Elijah of his title, a jab meant to wound. He stepped back, his voice rising. "Step out of the vehicle, slowly." By now, the street had begun to stir. A small crowd gathered, drawn by the unfolding scene of pedestrians pausing mid-step, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Some fumbled for their phones, the faint glow of screens lighting up as they started to record. Elijah noticed their stares, felt the weight of their attention, but his focus remained on Randy. He'd faced far worse than this battlefields, storms at sea, but never here. Not on the soil he'd sworn to protect. "Officer," he began, his voice low and steady, "you're making a mistake. I suggest you stop before this goes too far." Randy's response was a barked command, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Get out of the vehicle now, or I'll remove you by force. That's an order." The air grew thick, the tension coiling like a spring ready to snap. The onlookers fell silent, their collective breath held as if the slightest sound might tip the balance. Elijah's mind churned not with panic, but with a cold, disciplined fury he'd honed over years of service. With a heavy sigh, he unlatched the door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. Hands raised to signal he posed no threat. The pavement felt hard beneath his polished shoes, a stark contrast to the weight pressing down on his spirit. "On your knees," Randy snapped, his voice now laced with something uglier: hatred, perhaps, or a twisted satisfaction. Elijah froze, his eyes locking with Randy's in a moment that stretched into eternity. The officer's glare was unyielding, the gun in his holster a silent promise of violence. With no other choice, Elijah lowered himself to the ground, the cold concrete biting into his knees. His back remained straight, his hands clasped loosely behind his head, but inside, a storm raged. This wasn't just humiliation, it was a betrayal of everything he'd stood for. A stark reminder that justice could be twisted by those too small to wield it. The crowd swelled, their murmurs growing louder. Randy loomed over him, his shadow falling across Elijah like a dark omen. "You think you're special because of that uniform?" he sneered, his hands still hovering near his gun. "Everyone's equal under my jurisdiction. You don't get a pass because of some military badge." Elijah's jaw tightened, his gaze lifting to meet Randy's. Around them, the spectators stared at a woman in her mid-30s, her face creased with worry, whispered urgently into her phone, likely summoning help. Nearby, a teenage boy, his hoodie pulled low, muttered, "This is messed up," his voice trembling with indignation. His mother yanked him back to the curb, her eyes darting between her son and the scene unfolding before them, fear and anger warring in her expression. "Officer," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the noise with quiet authority, "you're making a grave mistake. I've given you my identification. I've followed every command. There's no reason to escalate this further." Randy ignored him, circling like a predator savoring its prey. "You Navy types always think you're above the law," he spat. "Let me tell you something, this is my street, my rules. If I think you're suspicious, you're suspicious. End of story." Elijah closed his eyes for a heartbeat, drawing a deep breath to steady the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Randy's words didn't wound him, they couldn't, but they crystallized a bitter truth. He'd spent his life resisting, no matter his medals, his rank, his service, to someone like Randy. He was nothing more than a target, a figure to be diminished. The crowd's murmurs grew into a low rumble as Randy pulled out his handcuffs, the metal glinting ominously in the sunlight. "Stand up," he barked. Elijah hesitated, his instinct screaming that this could spiral into chaos. But with dozens of phones trained on him, he knew resistance wasn't an option. Slowly, he rose, his movements fluid yet heavy with restraint. Randy grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that was more cruelty than necessity. Elijah winced, the cold bite of the cuffs snapping around his wrists, but he didn't fight. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, turning his head just enough to catch Randy's eye. "You're arresting me with no cause, no justification. This isn't law enforcement, it's abuse of power. You don't get to tell me how to do my job," Randy snapped, tightening the cuffs until they dug into Elijah's skin. "And I don't owe you an explanation." At that moment, a voice broke through the crowd. A young woman, no older than her late 20s, stepped forward. Her curly hair bounced in a tight ponytail, and her phone was raised high. The red recording light a defiant beacon. "This is illegal," she called out, her voice firm despite a slight tremor. "You can't just cuff someone for no reason. He's done nothing wrong." Randy whirled on her, his face flushing with rage. "Back off, lady. This is official police business." She didn't flinch. "We're all watching," she said, her voice steadying with every word. "We're recording, and we're not going to let you get away with this." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective outrage no longer silent, but a palpable force pressing in on Randy. His glare darkened, his hand twitching toward his weapon, but before he could retort, another voice sliced through the tension. "That's enough, Officer Thompson." The crowd parted like a tide, revealing Captain Sarah Martinez, Randy's direct supervisor. She strode forward, her police uniform pristine, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was a storm of fury and disbelief, her presence commanding the scene with an authority Randy could only mimic. Behind her, two other officers trailed, their expressions uneasy, their steps hesitant as they took in the spectacle. Elijah remained still, the cuffs biting into his wrists, but his eyes flickered with a quiet hope. Sarah's rival was a lifeline, a chance for reason to prevail. Randy froze, his bravado faltering as Sarah approached, her gaze locking onto him with an intensity that made the air tremble. The crowd held its breath, the woman with the phone still recording, the teenager clutching his mother's arm. all waiting to see what justice if any would emerge from this clash of power and pride. In that moment, Elijah's mind drifted beyond the humiliation, beyond the cold metal and the jeering officer. He thought of the lesson etched into his bones through years of service, that true power lies not in force, but in accountability. Randy's actions were a perversion of justice, a petty abuse that crumbled under scrutiny. And as Sarah's voice rose, firm and unyielding, Elijah knew this wasn't just his fight, it was a mirror held up to a system where the consequences of unchecked authority could no longer be ignored. The late afternoon sun hung low over Jacksonville, its golden rays stretching long shadows across the bustling street where a restless crowd had gathered. Their murmurs buzzed like a swarm of agitated bees, phones raised high to capture every fleeting moment of the unfolding drama. At the center of it all stood Captain Randy Thompson, his broad shoulders squared and his chest puffed out, though his voice carried a brittle edge of defensiveness. "I was just handling the situation," he insisted, his words aimed at no one in particular, as if trying to convince himself as much as the onlookers. His fingers twitched near his holster, betraying the unease he refused to show on his weathered face. Sarah Martinez, a captain with a reputation for cutting through nonsense, stormed forward, her boots striking the pavement with purpose. Her voice sliced through the hum of the crowd, sharp and unyielding, like a blade honed by years of frustration. "Handling what, exactly?" she snapped, her dark eyes narrowing as they locked onto Randy. The air around her crackled with authority, but as she approached the man in cuffs, her pace faltered, her breath caught in her throat, and her eyes widened with the slow, dawning weight of recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them, barely audible beneath the murmur of the crowd. The man in cuffs, Elijah Brooks, stood tall despite the metal biting into his wrists. His posture was steady, a product of decades of military discipline, but his deep brown eyes simmered with a quiet fury he kept tightly leashed. "Captain Martinez," he said, his voice smooth yet laced with a bitterness that cut deeper than any shout. "Good to see someone who recognizes me." The words were calm, almost polite, but they carried the weight of a man who'd been wronged and wasn't about to let it slide. Sarah's face drained of color, her usual composure fracturing as she spun toward Randy. "Take those cuffs off him," she ordered, her tone hard as steel, leaving no room for argument. Right now, the command echoed across the street, silencing the crowd as the tension thickened. Electric and heavy, like a storm about to break, Randy's jaw tightened, his pride warring with the reality of the moment. "Captain, he began, but Sarah cut him off, her voice rising to a thunderous pitch that made even the bravest onlookers flinch. "Now, Randy." The crowd held its breath, the air buzzing with anticipation as he fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling slightly under the weight of a dozen watchful eyes and recording lenses. With a reluctant click, the cuffs fell away, clattering to the ground. Elijah flexed his wrists, the faint red marks a silent testament to his ordeal. But he remained composed, his dignity unshaken a soldier through and through. Sarah stepped closer to Randy, her voice dropping to a furious hiss that only he could hear, though the crowd strained to catch every word. "What the hell were you thinking? Do you even know who this is?" Her eyes blazed with a mix of disbelief and rage. Her fists clenched at her sides as she fought to keep her temper in check. "I don't care who he is," Randy shot back, his defiance flaring like a cornered animal. "He looked suspicious, and I acted accordingly." His chest heaved, his face flushed with a stubborn resolve that bordered on reckless. "Suspicious?" Sarah's voice climbed again, incredulous, drawing the crowd in closer, their phones tilting to catch her every syllable. "You pointed a gun at a decorated commander in the United States Navy, a man on his way to a military event. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of consequence, as the reality of Randy's actions sank in it just for him, but for everyone watching. "I did my job," Randy insisted, though his voice wavered, a crack forming in his bravado. He shifted his weight, glancing at the sea of faces surrounding them, their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. "No, you didn't," Sarah said, stepping so close their noses nearly touched, her breath hot with fury. "You abused your authority, humiliated an innocent man, and made this department look like fools." Do you realize how many cameras are on us right now? Do you understand what's going to happen when this spreads online?" Her words were a whip, each one lashing at Randy's crumbling defenses. His face burned red, but he offered no reply, his silence a confession of its own. Turning back to Elijah, Sarah's expression softened, though guilt shadowed her eyes. "Commander Brooks," she said, her voice gentler now, almost pleading, "I am so sorry for what's happened here. Please know this does not represent the values of our department." She meant it, her sincerity raw and unguarded, but the words felt hollow even to her. Elijah met her gaze, his own steady and unyielding. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, his tone even but piercing, "it does. Or he wouldn't have felt empowered to do this in the first place." The truth in his words struck Sarah like a physical blow, and she flinched, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his accusation. She turned to the other officers lingering nearby, their faces a mix of uncertainty and unease. "Escort Officer Thompson back to the precinct," she ordered, her voice sharp again, cutting through their hesitation. "I'll deal with him personally." When they didn't move fast enough, she barked, "Now." The command jolted them into action, and they stepped toward Randy, who recoiled, his eyes wide with indignation. "You're really going to do this in front of everyone?" he asked, his voice dripping with wounded pride, as if the public nature of his disgrace stung more than the act itself. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her resolve unshaken. "Yes," she said, her tone cold and final, "because someone has to show the people watching that we're capable of holding our own accountable." The officers flanked Randy, leading him away as the crowd erupted into a chorus of whispers, some relieved, others outraged, all buzzing with the electricity of witnessing justice in motion. Elijah watched them go, his expression unreadable, a mask forged from years of facing far worse than this. He turned to Sarah, his voice low and deliberate. "This isn't over," he said, the words a quiet promise heavy with the weight of what was to come. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I know," she replied, her determination warring with the dread pooling in her stomach. "And I'll do everything I can to make it right." But Elijah wasn't sure anything could not after this. The sting of betrayal lingered, sharper than the cuffs that had bound him, a reminder that even those sworn to protect could wield power like a weapon. As the sun dipped lower, painting the Jacksonville skyline in hues of amber and shadow, the scene shifted to the precinct's briefing room. The air inside was stifling, thick with tension that clung to every surface like damp heat. Elijah sat at the far end of a long, rectangular table, his back ramrod straight, his hands folded neatly before him. To an outsider, he might have seemed calm, but his eyes told a different story, a storm of anger and resolve swirling beneath the surface, tempered only by the discipline that had carried him through decades of service. Across from him sat Sarah, the weight of her rank pressing down on her like a millstone. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles pale, as she wrestled with the shame and fury battling within her. To her right was Chief Raymond Harris, a man in his mid-50s with a stern, weathered face and graying hair cropped close to his scalp. His reputation preceded him, a leader who cared more for the department's polished image than the messy truth beneath it. His dark suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as they settled on Elijah. "Commander Brooks," Harris began, his voice measured and detached, like a man reading from a script he didn't fully believe. "Let me start by expressing the department's sincerest regrets for what transpired earlier today. Officer Thompson's actions were unacceptable and do not align with the values we uphold." The word regrets landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples of hollow silence through the room. Elijah raised an eyebrow, his silence louder than any rebuttal. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone demanded more than empty platitudes. Harris pressed on, undeterred. "We've already taken immediate action. Officer Thompson has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. And I can assure you, if found guilty of misconduct, he will face disciplinary action." If found guilty, Elijah leaned forward, his voice cutting through the chief's assurances like a blade. His gaze was piercing, unyielding, pinning Harris to his chair. "With all due respect, Chief, this isn't up for debate. There's a crowd full of witnesses and hours of footage circulating online. That proved exactly what happened. His words were sharp, controlled, but they carried the weight of a man who'd spent over 25 years serving his country, letting soldiers into war zones, upholding the highest standards of honor, only to be treated like a common thug on a public street. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her chair creaking under her restless movement. She wanted to speak, to bridge the widening chasm, but Harris held his ground, his frown deepening. "We understand that, Commander, but due process." "Spare me the procedural excuses," Elijah interrupted, his tone rising just enough to betray the fury he'd kept locked away. "I've dedicated my life to this country, Chief. I've faced enemies who respected me more than your officer did today. Thompson didn't just humiliate me, he humiliated your entire department. The same one that let him run unchecked for who knows how long." His hands clenched briefly on the table, then relaxed, a testament to the control he wielded even in his anger. Harris's jaw tightened, his composure fraying at the edges, but Sarah stepped in before the silence could stretch to thin. "Commander Brooks," she said softly, her voice a bomb against the rising heat. "I understand your anger, believe me, I feel it too, and I don't disagree with you. But please know we're committed to addressing this thoroughly." Her eyes pleaded with him, searching for a flicker of trust she wasn't sure she deserved. Elijah's gaze shifted to her, softening slightly, but losing none of its intensity. "Captain Martinez, I appreciate what you did out there truly, but this is bigger than today. I won't let this be buried like so many other incidents." His voice was low, steady, a vow etched in stone. The room fell into an uneasy hush, the weight of his words settling over them like dust. Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair, his stern facade cracking just enough to reveal the exhaustion beneath. "You're right," he conceded, though the admission seemed to pain him. "We can't ignore this, but you have to understand cases like this are complicated. There's a system in place, and that system is broken," Elijah countered, his tone unyielding. "You want to talk about systems? Let's talk about how Thompson's behavior isn't some isolated mistake. How many complaints has he had? How many warning signs did you overlook before today?" His eyes flicked between Harris and Sarah, searching for answers they weren't eager to give. Sarah's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line as her gaze darted briefly to Harris. She knew Summerthan Jalaya could see it in the flicker of hesitation, the way her fingers tightened on the table. He pressed harder, relentless. "Captain Martinez, you've worked with him. You're his superior. Don't tell me you never noticed anything." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Harris shot her a warning glance, his eyes narrowing, but Elijah wouldn't relent. "If this department wants even a shred of credibility, it starts with honesty. So I'll ask again, how many complaints?" Sarah exhaled, her shoulders sagging as the fight drained out of her. "5, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, fragile yet resolute. "In the past 3 years, there have been 5 formal complaints against Officer Thompson for excessive force or racial profiling." The confession hung in the air, a damning truth laid bare. Harris stiffened, his face hardening. "Sarah, no. He deserves to know." She cut him off, her voice firm now, her eyes flashing with defiance. "Those complaints were dismissed, every single one. Some for lack of evidence, others because the victims didn't pursue legal action. But that doesn't mean they weren't real." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line, his anger no longer simmering, but boiling over. Though his voice remained steady, dismissed, he repeated, the word of condemnation. "You had 5 chances to stop him, and you did nothing. And now you want me to trust that you'll handle this thoroughly." His eyes bored into Harris, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of that gaze. Commander Harris began, but Elijah wasn't finished. "Do you know what it feels like?" he said, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. Raw and unguarded for the first time. "To dedicate your life to protecting people, to upholding justice, only to have someone with a badge treat you like your existence is a threat. Like your service means nothing." He paused, letting the question linger, his chest rising and falling with the effort of holding back the torrent of emotion, threatening to spill over. Sarah's eyes glistened, her own guilt and frustration mirroring his pain. She'd seen the footage Ivorion had by now of the way Randy had drawn his weapon, the way he'd barked orders at Elijah as if he were a stranger. not a man who'd earned every stripe on his uniform. She wanted to fix it, to claw back the trust that had been shattered. But she knew words alone wouldn't be enough. The lesson here wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the corrosive danger of unchecked power, the way it festers when those in charge turn a blind eye. Justice, Elijah knew, wasn't a gift handed down, it was a battle fought and won, often against the very systems meant to uphold it. And as the room fell silent once more, the weight of that truth settled over them all, a call to action none could ignore. The air in the room hung thick and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were straining under the burden of unspoken truths. Elijah Brooks stood tall, his broad shoulders squared against an invisible weight, his dark eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished. He had given everything to this country, years of sweat, sleepless nights, and blood spilled in the name of justice, and equally to find himself stripped bare, reduced to nothing more than a target because of the melanin in his skin. His voice trembled not with fear, but with a raw, unshakable resolve as he spoke, each word a hammer striking the fragile veneer of the room's silence. Do you have any idea what it feels like to drop to your knees before a jeering crowd? The cold barrel of a gun kissing your temple, knowing that no medal, no rank, no lifetime of service can shield you from the prejudices of a man like Thompson? The stillness that followed was oppressive, a heavy fog pressing down on every soul present. Sarah Martinez, seated across the scratched wooden table, couldn't bring herself to lift her gaze from her hands, which twisted nervously in her lap. Her fingers, usually steady from years of wielding authority, now betrayed her turmoil, trembling as Elijah's words carved into her conscience. She'd always prided herself on fairness, on being the kind of officer who listened, who cared, but now doubt gnawed at her like a relentless beast. Had she been blind? Had she, too, played a part in this festering wound? Beside her, Chief Harris shifted in his chair, the creak of the old wood slicing through the quiet. His jaw tightened, his discomfort palpable, but Elijah offered no reprieve, no pause for the man to gather his scattered defenses. This isn't just about me, Elijah pressed on, his voice steady as a drumbeat yet crackling with the electricity of suppressed rage. This is about every single person who's been pulled over without cause, shoved against a wall, or stripped of their dignity by someone hiding behind your badge. It's about a system that cradles men like Thompson, shielding them from the consequences of their cruelty. And if you think a slap on the wrist or a hollow apology muttered into a microphone will stitch this wound shut, you're deluding yourselves. Harris opened his mouth, his lips parting as if to protest. But the door swung open with a groan before he could muster a word. A young officer stepped in, his boots scuffing the linoleum floor, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "Chief Harris," he stammered, clutching a manila folder as though it were a live grenade. "You need to see this." Harris reached for it with a frown, his thick fingers flipping through the pages as the room held its breath. With each turn, his expression darkened, shadows pooling in the lines of his weathered face. Sarah leaned closer, her curiosity warring with a sinking dread, and as her eyes skimmed the text, the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a ghost of the confident commander she'd once been. Elijah watched them both, his sharp instincts humming like a taut wire. Something in their reactions, the way Harris's shoulders slumped, the way Sarah's breath hitched, told him this was no minor revelation. "What is it?" he demanded, his tone cutting through the haze. Harris hesitated, his eyes flickering with something akin to shame, before sliding the folder across the table with a slow, deliberate push. Elijah snatched it up, his hands steady despite the storm brewing within him. As he scanned the pages, his stomach churned, a sickening twist of anger and betrayal. This wasn't just a handful of complaints Sarah had vaguely mentioned in passing. No, this was a litany of since dozens of incident reports, hastily scribbled internal memos, and whispered grievances that had been buried deep in the department's shadows. Some dated back nearly 10 years, stamped with words like resolved or closed despite flimsy evidence. Others had been hushed with payouts, the victims silenced by cold cash. But the most damning blow came in the form of a memo, 3 years old, its ink long faded, but its words searing. A recommendation from Harris himself to shuffle Thompson off to a desk job after he'd brutalized a teenage boy. A recommendation that had been ignored, left to gather dust while Thompson roamed free. "You knew," Elijah said, his voice low and molten, each syllable dripping with accusation. "You knew he was a walking disaster, and you let him loose on these streets." Harris flinched as though struck, his broad frame shrinking under the weight of Elijah's stare. "It's not that simple, officer," he began, but Elijah surged to his feet, cutting him off with a fury that crackled in the air. "Don't." He gripped the folder like a blade, its edges crumpling in his fist. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. Not to me, and not to the people out there screaming for justice." Sarah rose too, her movements hesitant, but her voice firm despite the tremor in it. "Commander, I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," she said, her eyes pleading for a chance at redemption. Elijah turned to her, his face a mask of unreadable stone. "Then start by owning it, all of you." Without another word, he stormed out, the folder still clutched in his hand, his boots echoing down the precinct's sterile halls as the crowd outside parted like a sea, their shouts and camera flashes a chaotic symphony he barely registered. Inside, Sarah and Harris sat frozen, the silence between them a chasm too vast to bridge. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt the suffocating weight of her own complicity, a bitter taste that lingered on her tongue. She'd always seen herself as a force for good, a steady hand in a turbulent world, but now, staring at the empty doorway Elijah had left behind, she wondered how many times she'd turned away, how many whispers she'd dismissed. Harris, too, felt the ground shift beneath him, a man accustomed to control, to sweeping problems under the rug with a gruff command. He realized with a cold shiver that this storm wouldn't be contained. Not this time. That night, Jacksonville thrummed with restless energy, the city's pulse quickening as tension coiled through its streets. The video had spread like wildfire. Elijah Brooks, a decorated commander, forced to his knees on cracked pavement, Randy Thompson looming over him, gun in hand, his face twisted with a sneer. It played on every screen, dissected by breathless news anchors, its every frame fueling a nationwide outcry. Hashtags like "Justice for Elijah" and "accountability" blazed across social media, while outside the Jacksonville Police Department, a swelling tide of protesters waved signs decrying racist policing and pledging solidarity with the man they'd come to see as a symbol. The crowd grew with each passing hour, their voices merging into a roar that shook the humid night air. In the dim glow of his living room, Elijah sat slumped in an armchair, the folder splayed open on the coffee table before him like a grim trophy. His wife, Donna, perched across from him, her warm brown eyes clouded with a mix of worry and righteous anger. She'd been his rock for decades, her quiet strength a lifeline through every trial. But now she looked at him with a fear she couldn't hide. "You've barely said a word since you got home," she said, her voice soft but insistent, breaking the stillness that had settled over them like dust. "What's going through your head?" Elijah leaned back, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the armrest, the sound a faint echo of the chaos outside. "It's worse than I ever imagined, Donna. Thompson isn't just one rotten apple, he's proof of a sickness that's spread through the whole damn tree. Dozens of complaints, all swept under the rug. And Harris knew, he knew, and he let it happen." Donna shook her head, her curls bouncing with the motion, her voice rising with a rare edge of frustration. "You shouldn't have to shoulder this alone. Elijah, this isn't just your battle to fight." He met her gaze, his tone firm but laced with a tenderness reserved only for her. "It is mine, Donna. If I stay silent, if I walk away, I'm no different from the ones who buried those reports. I can't live with that." She crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I know you're right. I just hate watching you carry this. It's not fair, it's never been fair." Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped as though in prayer. "Fairness stopped being an option for me a long time ago. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about every soul who's been crushed under Thompson's boot, every life shattered because no one cared enough to stop him." Donna reached out, her hand covering his, her touch a quiet anchor. "Then do what you have to, but promise me you won't let it break you." He looked into her eyes, the storm within him softening for a moment. "I promise." The next morning, Elijah stood at a podium outside the precinct, facing a sea of face reporters with flashing cameras, protesters with clenched fists, and onlookers drawn by the electric hum of history unfolding. Behind him, a small group of supporters flanked his sidus community leaders with weathered faces and retired military officers in crisp jackets, their presence a silent testament to his sacrifice. He adjusted the microphone, his hands steady despite the thunder in his chest, and took a deep breath as the crowd hushed, every eye locked on him. "Good morning," he began, his voice ringing clear and strong, cutting through the morning haze. "I want to thank every one of you standing here today, those who've lifted my story, those who've stood by me, and those who refuse to let this injustice fade into silence. Your strength means more than I can ever say." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the throng, feeling the weight of their expectations settle on his shoulders. What happened to me 2 days ago wasn't a fluke. It wasn't one officer losing his temper on a rough day. It was the inevitable outcome of a system that's let men like Randy Thompson wield power like a club, unchecked and unchallenged. A system that's chosen to bury the truth rather than face it. A system that's failed every one of us. The crowd stirred, a ripple of applause breaking out, but Elijah raised a hand, his expression stern, silencing them. "This isn't about me alone. It's about every person who's been profiled because of how they look, harassed because of where they live, or humiliated because of who they are. It's about the trust that's been shattered between those who wear the badge and the communities they've sworn to protect. It's about the lives ruined because no one had the courage to say enough." From the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of Movement's Martinez stepping out of the precinct, her uniform crisp but her face drawn, hovering at the edge of the crowd like a specter. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, but Elijah pressed on, his voice sharpening like a blade. "I've seen the proof with my own eyes, page after page of complaints, of cries for help, all ignored. Thompson wasn't an exception. He was a product, propped up by a department more interested in its image than its duty. And it's not just him, it's every officer who turned a blind eye, every superior who brushed off a report, every leader who let this poison fester." The crowd erupted, cheers and shouts of agreement crashing like waves, but Elijah stood unmoved, his focus unwavering. "I'm demanding a full, independent investigation into the Jacksonville Police Department," he declared, his words a clarion call. "I'm demanding transparency, accountability, and reform that means something, and I won't rest until it's done." The roar of approval shook the ground beneath him, but as he stepped back from the podium, his pulse pounding in his ears, Sarah approached, her steps tentative. "Commander Brooks," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, laced with a vulnerability that caught him off guard. "Can we talk?" He studied her for a long moment, weighing her intent, before giving a curt nod. They moved away from the clamor, finding a quiet corner near the precinct's edge, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above, it was a fire that had to be kindled, fought for, and guarded fiercely. And the consequences of power abused, of trust betrayed, rippled far beyond the moment, leaving scars that demanded reckoning. On a tense afternoon at the station, Sarah stood before Elijah, her hands clasped tightly together, fingers fidgeting as a storm of nerves churned within her. The air felt thick with unspoken words, the weight of her guilt pressing down like an invisible hand. "I owe you more than just an apology," she started, her voice trembling slightly as she forced the words out. "Not only for what went down that day, but for all the moments leading up to it, times I stayed silent, the chances I let slip by. You were right all along. I should have stepped up. I should have raised my voice long before it came to this." Her eyes darted to the floor, then back to him, searching for a reaction. Elijah, arms crossed tightly over his chest, stood like a statue carved from stone, his face a mask of guarded emotion. "So why didn't you?" he asked, his tone flat, betraying neither anger nor forgiveness. Sarah paused, her breath catching as she grappled with the truth she'd buried deep, fear. She finally confessed, the words spilling out like a long-held secret. "Fear of the blowback, of losing everything I'd worked for, my job, my reputation. Fear of standing alone against a tide I wasn't sure I could fight. but that's no justification. I let that fear cloud my judgment, blind me to what I knew was right." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, as if admitting it aloud lifted some of the burden. Elijah tilted his head ever so slightly, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied her. "And now, what's your move?" he pressed, his words carrying the weight of a challenge. Straightening her shoulders, Sarah felt a spark of resolve ignite within her, pushing back the shadows of doubt. "I've already taken the first step," she said, her gaze locking with his. "This morning, I filed a detailed statement with the state attorney's office. Every single thing I know about Thompson's past, every failure of the department to act, it's all there, on record. And I'm stepping down as captain." Elijah's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of surprise breaking through his stoic exterior. "You're walking away?" he asked, his voice softening with curiosity. "I'm owning it," Sarah corrected, her tone firm yet tinged with a quiet sadness. "I'm clearing the way for someone who'll lead with the integrity I failed to show. But before I go, I'm all in to help you with that investigation. Whatever you need, statements, contacts, anything, I've got your back." Elijah held her gaze for a long, heavy moment, the silence stretching between them like a tightrope. Then, with a slow nod, he let the tension ease. "Thank you, Captain Martinez," he said, testing the title. A faint, bittersweet smile tugged at Sarah's lips as she shook her head. "Just Sarah now. I don't think I've earned that title anymore." They parted ways under the dim flicker of the station's fluorescent lights, Elijah heading home, with exhaustion clinging to his bones, but a fire still burning in his spirit. He knew the road ahead was long and treacherous restance would come. The media's spotlight would fade, and the deep-rooted change he craved might take years, even decades. Yet, for the first time, a fragile seed of hope took root. Progress, however small, felt within reach. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over his porch, Elijah sat beside Donna, the woman who'd been his anchor through the storm. His phone buzzed, pulling him from the quiet moment. An email from an investigative journalist lit up the screen, detailing newly uncovered records damning evidence of Thompson's abuses and the misconduct of other officers. The journalist wanted to team up, to amplify the truth and expose the rot festering in the department. Elijah's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening like steel. This wasn't just about justice for himself anymore, it was about ensuring no one else would suffer under the weight of unchecked power. Meanwhile, across town at the precinct, Randy Thompson sat alone in a cramped, windowless room, the air stale and suffocating. His badge and gun, once symbols of his authority, had been stripped away, leaving him exposed. The walls seemed to creep closer with every passing minute, the hum of the building's old pipes a mocking reminder of his fall. For years, he'd seen himself as untouchable, a king in a kingdom of his own making. Now, with internal investigations tightening their grip and public outrage swelling like a tidal wave, that illusion shattered. His hands, once steady with arrogance, trembled faintly as the reality sank in was no longer the predator, but the prey. In another corner of the precinct, Chief Harris stood motionless, staring into the dark glass of his office window. His reflection stared back, a tired man with lines etched deep into his face, a man who knew his time was running out. The truth about Thompson's years of buried complaints and ignored warning shed erupted into the open, fueled by Elijah's relentless push for accountability. It was a domino effect Harris couldn't stop, a crumbling of the system he'd helped uphold. His fingers brushed the edge of his desk where his own badge lay, its shine dulled by the weight of his complicity. For some, this collapse was a reckoning. For others, it was the first brick in a foundation for something better. 2 months had passed since that fateful clash outside the cafe in Arlington Hills, but its echoes rippled far beyond Jacksonville's borders. What started as a single act of brutality had spiraled into a movement, a force Elijah Brooks never imagined he'd ignite. The city stood at a turning point, wrestling with the ghosts of its past and the uncertain promise of its future. On a crisp November morning, Elijah found himself on the stage of the Jacksonville Civic Center, surrounded by a coalition of voiceless activists with clenched fists, military leaders in crisp uniforms, community organizers with weathered notepads. The auditorium buzzed with energy. Hundreds packed into the seats, thousands more streaming online. It was a moment heavy with possibility, and Elijah felt its gravity settle into his chest. Adjusting the microphone with a steady hand, he looked out at the sea of faces, black, white, young, old, all united by a shared hunger for change. Some he knew from the protests, their chants still ringing in his ears. Others from late-night meetings, their stories etched into his memory. The room hushed as he began, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the stillness. "Good morning, everyone. Before we dive in, I need to take us back. 2 months ago, I was just another name on a long list of people humiliated, dehumanized, treated like my life years of service meant nothing." He paused, letting the silence carry the weight of his pain. "I was lucky. I walked away. Too many who look like me never get that chance. Their voices, their stories are why we're here." This was never just about me. Applause swelled, a rolling wave of affirmation, but Elijah raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "Since that day, I've watched this city knit itself together in ways I never thought possible. We've marched, we've demanded answers, we've fought for reform. It's not enough yet, but we've cracked the surface." He gestured toward the edge of the stage, where Sarah Martinez stood, her posture calm but her eyes alight with purpose. Take Sarah Martinez. She was part of the machine once, a captain who kept her head down, but she chose to step up, to own her mistakes. She didn't just walk away, she resigned and turned into one of the fiercest voices, calling for change from the inside. That's what justice looks like. Accountability. Even when it's messy. Sarah dipped her head, a flush of humility warming her cheeks as the crowd clapped. Elijah pressed on, his voice steady as a drumbeat. "Over these past 2 months, we've launched a full, independent investigation into the Jacksonville Police Department. It's already unearthed decades of roadabus, corruption, things we whispered about but couldn't prove. Now we can. Officers like Randy Thompson aren't just facing questions, facing charges. He wasn't some lone wolf. He thrived in a system that shielded him. But that system's coming apart, brick by brick, right here in Jacksonville. And it's because of you, everyone in this room, everyone watching, everyone who's refused to let this die." The room erupted, a standing ovation shaking the walls, but Elijah waved them down once more. "Here's the truth," he said, his tone softening, almost tender. "Real change is a slow burn. It's grueling, it's heartbreaking, and sometimes it feels like you're shouting into the void. But it's not impossible. It starts with us holding each other to the fire, learning, demanding better." He stepped back, and the cheers washed over him like a tide. For the first time in weeks, a small, genuine smile broke across his face. It wasn't the finish line, but it was a stride forward, a testament to the power of collective will. That night, Elijah sank into a chair on his porch, the cool air brushing his skin as Donna handed him a steaming mug of coffee. "You were incredible today," she said, her voice warm with pride. "You've got a gift for moving people." He chuckled, the sound low and weary, taking a sip. "It wasn't me alone. It was the community, the ones who showed up. This is bigger than any one of us." She rested a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "That's what makes you special, Elijah. But don't forget to breathe, okay?" "I will," he promised, leaning back, a fleeting peace settling over him, fragile, but enough to carry him through the night. Across town, Sarah sat in a modest office, her new role as director of a non-profit for police accountability still sinking in. Papers and emails cluttered her desk, but she moved with purpose, a woman reborn. Her phone lit up with a text from Elijah. "Thank you for everything. Keep pushing." She smiled, typing back, "You too. We're just warming up." At the precinct, the air hummed with tension, the winds of change stirring through the halls. For every Randy Thompson brought low, for every Chief Harris facing the end, there was a lesson carved into the chaos. Power, when abused, breeds its own downfall. Justice, though slow, was a force that could reshape even the hardest stony end in Jacksonville. That reshaping had only just begun. The air in the precinct had grown thick with tension, long before Chief Harris's resignation became official. For years, he had ruled with an iron fist, his word law, his decisions unquestioned. Until the investigation tore through the fawade. When the evidence came to light, it was damning, a tangled web of covered-up misconduct. Buried reports and silenced complaints. The man who once strode through the station with unshakable confidence now sat in his office, head bowed, hands trembling as he signed the papers that ended his career. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was personal. His wife barely looked at him anymore, and the officers he'd once commanded turned their backs, their loyalty evaporating like mist in the morning sun. Justice, it seemed, had a way of catching up, even to those who thought themselves untouchable. In his place came Chief Amara Jackson, a woman whose very presence shifted the room. She arrived from a nearby city, her reputation preceding her like a storm on the horizon, fierce, unyielding, and committed to tearing down the rot that had festered for decades. Her skin bore the rich hue of resilience, and her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd fought battles others could only imagine. On her first day, she stood before the precinct, her voice steady but sharp, promising reform not as a suggestion, but as an inevitability. She overhauled the training programs with meticulous care, ensuring every officer understood the line between duty and tyranny. New oversight committees sprang up, their members a mix of civilians and seasoned watchdogs, each meeting crackling with debates over accountability. Policies on the use of force were rewritten, line by line, late into the night, as Amara pored over every word, determined to forge a system that served rather than oppressed. It wasn't flawless. Resistance simmered beneath the surface. Old guard officers grumbling in the locker rooms, their whispers a quiet rebellion against change. Progress crawled forward, inch by painstaking inch, but for the first time in years, a flicker of hope pierced the gloom. The lesson was clear: power, when abused, crumbled under its own weight, and justice demanded patience as much as it did resolve. Meanwhile, Randy Thompson's world had collapsed into a heap of ash and regret. Once a swaggering figure in his crisp uniform, badge gleaming like a medal of honor, he now sat in a dimly lit apartment, the walls closing in around him. The department had cut him loose without hesitation, fired, stripped of his gun, his identity as an officer reduced to a memory. The charges piled up like storm clouds, multiple counts of abuse of power, falsified reports scribbled in haste to hide his brutality, an excessive force that left bruises on both bodies and consciences. He'd become a cautionary tale, a living emblem of everything the community despised, a system that had shielded him until it couldn't anymore. As he awaited trial, the silence was suffocating. Friends he'd once laughed with over beers vanished, their numbers disconnected, their doors unanswered. The department that had once been his shield now treated him like a stranger. Alone with his thoughts, Randy traced the cracks in his life, each one a consequence of the power he'd wielded like a club. Justice didn't just punish, it stripped away illusions, leaving nothing but the truth. Months later, Elijah Carter stood before his bedroom mirror, the early morning light spilling through the curtains and catching the edges of his reflection. His fingers fumbled with the knot of his tie, a deep burgundy fabric that felt heavier today, not from its weight, but from the moment it represented. He was preparing to leave for Washington, D.C., where a congressional committee had invited him to speak on police reform. The honor was undeniable, a recognition of the years he'd spent shouting into the void, demanding change when no one seemed to listen. But more than that, it was a chance, a platform to amplify the voices of those who'd been crushed under the boots of corruption. His chest tightened with a mix of pride and nerves as he smoothed the tie, his mind racing with the words he'd rehearsed 100 times. He thought of the protests, the sleepless nights, the faces of those who'd trusted him to keep fighting. This wasn't just a speech, it was a lifeline. In the doorway, Donna leaned against the frame, her arms crossed casually, though her eyes shimmered with quiet admiration. She'd been there through it all: late-night strategy sessions, the tears he'd hidden from everyone else, the moments he'd nearly given up. "You look good," she said, her voice warm, a smile tugging at her lips. Elijah glanced at her in the mirror, catching the way her expression softened. "Thanks," he replied, his tone lighter than he felt. "You think they're ready for me?" Donna let out a low, playful chuckle, stepping closer. "Oh, they don't stand a chance." Her confidence steadied him, a tether to the ground when his thoughts threatened to spiral. He turned, brushing a quick kiss against her cheek, the faint scent of her perfume lingering as he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. The fight was far from over. Years of entrenched power wouldn't topple in a day, but as he stepped into the crisp morning air, Elijah felt a rare surge of certainty. They were gaining ground, piece by piece, and that was enough to keep going. Around them, the city hummed with its own rhythm. Officer Patel, a young recruit who'd joined under Amar's new regime, lingered in the precinct break room, sipping coffee that had gone cold. He'd seen the old Celeste once Randy had. Dr. Eden felt a chill every time he thought of how close he'd come to idolizing the wrong kind of cop. Now, he attended the reform training sessions, scribbling notes about de-escalation tactics, his earnestness earning him quiet nods from Amara. Down the hall, Mrs. Rivera, a widow who'd sat on the oversight committee since its inception, argued passionately about transparency, her voice rising over the murmurs of skepticism. She carried a photo of her son, lost to a bad call years ago, and it fueled every word she spoke. Outside, the streets bore scars of the past. Graffiti faded but still legible. Corners where tensions once flared, but they also carried signs of something new. A mural of unity stretched across a brick wall, painted by kids who'd grown up watching the protests. Change was slow, messy, and imperfect, but it was real. And in its wake came a truth as old as time. Power without restraint invited ruin, while justice, hard-won and relentless, lit the way forward.